Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. My name, as always, it's constant reader Scott Daly, and I'm joined this week by my mystical Western storyteller, Matt Freeman. How's it going, Matt?
Oh, I'm doing all right. Just, telling my story around this campfire.
It's a wonderful story too, Matt.
Yeah, it's a tragedy.
Oh, is it?
Spoilers. It's a tragedy.
Well, it's not spoilers if you haven't seen the end and already know how it ends. Then...
I'm seeing some parallels to some other stories that are causing me to think maybe. And also there's the fact that, we know that Susan dies horribly at some point. So
yeah. So this week on the show, we are beginning part 2 of Wizard and Glass, titled Susan, and we'll be discussing chapters 1 through 4. Roland's story begins in the small town of Hambry in the barony of Magus as a young woman named Susan meets with the old witch Rhea, or Rhea. I always said Rhea, but the audiobook said Rhea, so I don't know what to believe anymore.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go with whatever my mouth says. I'm not gonna be picky.
Sure. An old witch named Rhea to test for her honesty, aka virginity, before becoming a mistress to the mayor. On her way home, she runs across a young man named Will Dearborn, who is actually our Roland Deschain. Both are immediately changed by this chance encounter. But there's trouble in the air as the big coffin hunters, men loyal to the good man, are here to hide and protect a strange pink glass orb. Matt, what did you think about this week's reading?
Well, it sure is a Western. I think if I stand back from it all, from all the stuff we read this week, I think the uncomfortableness and horror of the Rhea section was what stands out to me the most as something that'll just stay with me forever. And I can't wait to talk about that part with you specifically. Mm-hmm. I also love the time we get to spend with young Roland, which I think is really beautifully executed.
Yeah.
And of course, I love the character of Susan. I think I kind of picked up from you that I was looking forward to meeting Susan, and I think Susan might be the one place where we can really see how King has actually improved as a writer, even since The Wastelands, because as good as Drawing of the Three and The Wastelands are, I feel like Susan's whole character introduction is just note perfect.
Cool. Yeah, I can't wait to talk about that. That makes me very excited. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. This is such a Western, but it's not just a Western, right? Like, I think I talk, and we're going to talk a little bit later, how there's a lot of fairy tale elements to this as well. Like, the beginning of this week's reading is a witch. We're like in the perspective of a witch as she's like planning the downfall of a beautiful young, not princess, but, princess of the town, let's say.
Yeah. Sure.
So there's a lot of fairy tale stuff going on here as well. There's this magic object that King has introduced here. We don't really understand what's going on, but it's once again King kind of mixing genres in really fun ways. And I have been looking forward to this story since we started this project. I have said on record that Wizard and Glass is my favorite Dark Tower book, and it is the story of Susan that is because of that. I think this is just some of King's finest writing as he weaves this tale of Roland and Susan and everything that's going to happen here. So it was so fun to read these 4 chapters. I think it's a really good setting, Matt. Like I think I did not plan really that much of where we were going to start and stop in our readings every week. I really just did it based on page number because I didn't have time to go through and read every single book and make distinctions like that. But I'm very happy with where this week's stops because it feels like we did our introduction. Like we did the introductory act. We met all our players and we met the ways in which and we kind of hinted towards the ways in which these characters are going to be in conflict with each other in the future. And then we stop. And then next week is when that ball is really going to start rolling forward. So I think it's a really great place to stop. And I think these are 4 great introductory chapters of this story that Roland is telling.
Yeah, I guess I don't know how long it's going to be, but this definitely felt like a solid kind of act 1,
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So yeah, I'm so excited to move on.
All right, well, let's just go ahead and do it. Let's move on and talk about this week's reading. Before we do that, just a really, really quick announcement. One of our other podcasts on the Doof Media Network is called The Doofcast. It's our variety show where Matt and I talk about a bunch of different things. One of them is movies. We talk about movies a lot on that show. And a movie that we are doing this week, this Friday, is called In the Mouth of Madness. It is the John Carpenter movie based on some Lovecraftian horror stuff. I think it's right up the alley of the people that might be listening to this show, which is why I'm bringing it up here at the top. So if you've seen In the Mouth of Madness or want to see In the Mouth of Madness, now is a great time to do so. And then you can join us when we talk about it on Friday.
Yeah, we had a good talk, or we didn't actually, because we haven't talked about it yet.
Wow,
but
that's like it was very presumptuous of how good our talk is going to be.
Confident that we're going to have a good talk. What's funny is I feel like we've already had the talk. Well,
we talked about it briefly before we were recording, which is kind of like having the talk, but not having the talk.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's horror. It sort of feels like a Stephen King story in some ways, but obviously it's probably more Lovecraftian than it is Stephen King.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like there's a town, like a New England town created by the author. That's like straight out of Stephen King. So I think it's having some fun there. But yeah, it'll be out this Friday, the Doofcast. Go to doofmedia.com and look up the Doofcast and make sure you subscribe to that feed as well, because it's just as good as this one. I think.
Yeah, and the fun thing about that channel is you can just scroll down through all of our past episodes and just pick and choose if you see any that look fun to you, because there's obviously no like order to things. Yeah, we got an email from one of our listeners who said they were doing exactly that, which is very exciting. When you come in because of Kingslingers, but find some of our other work. So thank you to the person who sent that to us. And hopefully the rest of you do that. And we'll stop plugging ourselves now and we'll start actually doing what we're supposed to be doing, which is talking about the book. So sounds good. Let's do that. All right. We begin this week's discussion with Chapter 1. It's titled Beneath the Kissing Moon. And this week's reading and the story of Susan Delgado begins with another moon, Matt. Unlike the demon moon of Part 1, Chapter 1, this is the kissing moon. This is the good moon, not the bad moon. This is also a symbol that we've kind of moved back in time before everything moved on. I remember the opening of this book talked about how the demon moon was unnecessary because there are demons everywhere now. Mm-hmm. But here we're still under the kissing moon. So look, it's in the past happy times before everything went bad. Yeah, I like that. Unfortunately, beneath this kissing moon is not... Well, she's not a demon, but she's close enough. We meet Rhea of the Coos, the woman who Roland compared to last week to almost as bad as the Man in Black himself. He got very close to saying that this is that woman, right? He says that woman. This is the person that Roland was talking about. And King spends, the early part of this whole introductory of the Susan story answering some questions about last week's reading. Roland randomly just shouted out some names, Reynolds, DePape, Jonas, and that woman. And in this brief introduction, we see who all these people are. Those three men are part of a group called the Big Coffin Hunters, and we'll learn more about them later. But this is the woman to which Roland referred. This is Rhea. And King wastes no time showing us just how fucking terrible she is. Yeah, it's actually quite unsettling being in Rhea's head. There's this edge to the way that he writes her where you never quite know what she's going to do. Even from the moment we meet her, we're just like worried about where things are going. Mm-hmm. It's kind of uncomfortable. This is one of the few times where I stopped listening and I wasn't eager to listen again. And it wasn't because I wasn't enjoying the story or wanted to know where things were going. I was just uncomfortable with Rhea. She's so awful. Yeah, she is, and she's like I like what you said about you don't know what she's gonna do or where she's gonna go, and I think it's just because her mind is kind of frantic in some ways. Like it just jumps all over the place and she's thinking about so many different things and it's going a mile a minute. Like there's a part I want to read a little bit later where she goes on this long, paragraph long rant about men. And it's just like her brain's running a mile a minute and it's all
bad.
Yeah.
It's all bad.
Right. And then she'll like seem to have these flickers of humanity, and then it like dives right back into like, I have to get revenge on this girl for nothing.
Yeah, for absolutely nothing. Yeah. Yeah. I want to talk about Coos Hill a little bit, because she's called Rhea of the Coos because she lives on Coos Hill. I once again spent way too much time looking up like if Coos has a specific meaning outside of the story, and honestly, Matt, I did not find a whole lot. Birds coo, of course. So, but it didn't have the little. I forget what the is that an MLAT? The two dots over the O. I'm not sure what the technical definition of that is. But the closest thing I found actually that the word coos is like a Dutch diminutive of Jacob, aka like the father of the tribes of Israel. I don't know what that means or how we could relate that back to Rhea or anything, but it's interesting, I guess.
It is interesting. I mean, to me, I didn't actually look to see if it had any meaning because I didn't recognize it and I didn't think that it might. But it's a good example of a word that just kind of sounds like it means something. Like like it's like it fits into a word slot in your brain between like two other words that do exist, and you're like, oh yeah, that's probably a word. And then it kind of borrows the connotations of the surrounding words. I don't know. That probably doesn't make any sense. But like, yeah, I'm fascinated by how King is able to do this. Kind of have made up words that still feel a certain way. Like this is a word that to me has negative connotations by itself, and I can't even explain why.
No, I totally agree with you. And that's kind of where I settled on this whole thing when I wasn't able to find a clear, obvious, here's what King was going for thing. I mean, sometimes in books, this is like the opposite of what we do. But sometimes in books, the name doesn't mean anything. It's just there for a feeling. It's just there to elicit an emotion. And I think Rhea of the Coos has like a gross connotation to it. Like it feels nasty. Just say it, like Rhea of the Coos.
Yeah.
Like it just feels disgusting. It feels off-putting. It feels unsettling. And I think that is absolutely what he's going for here.
I mean, I think Rhea is like the name of like a Greek god. Mm-hmm. But what's funny is that's like when you say Rhea, when you just said that out loud, my mind immediately went to like diarrhea, you know, and because I really think that's a lot of like King's superpower is his ability to like subtly tug at the connotations of things that you're not even aware of consciously. Mm-hmm. Like maybe you didn't think of diarrhea until I said it, but now you're certainly like, yep, that fits, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I had not thought about diarrhea, but now that is all I will hear. Well, it's because I'd never pronounced it as Rhea in my head, right? Yeah. It was always Rhea to me. So now it's diarrhea of the koozie.
Yeah. Or Seborrhea. You know.
Oh, man. So there, I'm not going to read this whole paragraph because it's Rhea's long rant about men. Right. So she says she snorted. Men were funny, so they were. And the most amusing thing about them was how little they knew it. Men with their swaggering, belt-hitching names for themselves. Men so proud of their muscles, their drinking capacities, their eating capacities. So everlastingly proud of their pricks. Yet even in these times when a good many of them could shoot nothing but strange, bent seed that produced children fit only to be drowned in the nearest well. But it was never their fault, was it, dear? No, always it was the woman, her womb, her fault. And I mean, this is really interesting to me because Rhea is a monster, absolutely a monster. But I do think there's a little bit of this rant of hers about men that is understandable and is reflexive of the world in which these women live. I think a lot of this early part of the story is Susan coming to terms with the fact that she has just entered into an arrangement to be a mistress and is going through this horrible ritual to be assaulted by Rhea in order to be able to get into that thing. And this is kind of like, what other choice does she have, right? In this world, these are the only cards she has. Oh, yeah. And so I think it's really interesting the way Rhea goes on this long, long rant about men, and Rhea's the worst, but you're like, yeah, I get it. There's something like justifiably angry in this rant, I think, as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much anger in it that it makes you suspect that terrible things have happened to her, and she does live in this terrible world where you can almost be certain that terrible things have happened to her, and this is the kind of the glimpses of humanity that I was talking about, where it's like, yeah, she's rageful, she has this kind of like rambling way of thinking about it, but it's also very understandable. Like when I was reading this, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like this is a sort of understandable motivation and maybe sort of subtle backstory to this really screwed up character.
Sure.
And really, like, you know, I think we're going to talk about it in a minute, but when she kind of dumps this like reality check on Susan, that to me was also a moment of humanity where she's sort of being cruel in how she's delivering it, but she's also helping Susan by
waking her up to the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's interesting because she kind of serves that dual purpose of being the wicked witch of the fairy tale while also being like the fairy godmother.
Yeah.
That's probably a little too far. She's definitely not a fairy godmother.
That is fun. Yeah, I mean, and she's also obviously just like desperately lonely, but seems to be the kind of person who like is too awful and would just scare anyone away who could potentially come close to her. So it's kind of mildly tragic. Like what's funny is while I was reading it, I didn't feel any of these things that I'm talking about right now. I just was like, God, she sucks. She's awful. I hate her. But like, it's all there under the surface to make her just kind of a pitiful kind of tragic and terrible.
Totally. So these foolish men that Rhea is ranting about have just given her a quote unquote marvel to keep safe with explicit instructions not to look at it. But of course, Rhea is going to look at it. She removes a keyless box from a magical trap door hidden beneath her house. It's actually a trap door that's guarded by her poisonous snake friend that she takes 2 drops of venom from, I guess, signaling that she's basically built up an immunity to this venom, even though it still kind of makes her sway and her vision spins. That's how powerful the venom is. But it does strike me like how magical things have gotten so quickly here, Matt. Like we always knew there was magic in Roland's world. That's been true basically since the beginning, but it's never been quite this explicitly magical. Like we have this hidden trap door with this magical artifact in it, and we see a little bit later that Rhea like creates fire via a spell. She's literally a witch, like in every way. And I think to me, this reinforces the idea that we are inside a story. This is a story within a story, a Western, yes, but as we talked about, also a fairy tale complete with a wicked witch and this shiny apple. Yeah,
that's interesting. I do enjoy the matching together of genres. And I mean, this definitely, like you mentioned, it felt like it feels like a Brothers Grimm type thing that's happening. It's just the whole tidbit here, basically, until they meet up with Roland. It's not a Western. It's a fairy tale. It's Brothers Grimm. And yeah, it's definitely more sort of overt and almost whimsical, but in a twisted and evil way than like anything that the Man in Black ever did. Like he never waved his hand and made a fire that I can recall. Maybe he did actually. I don't think so.
Well, I mean, we saw him. We saw like the way he constructed his fire was weird and otherworldly almost. So I think you can maybe make an assumption that he cast a spell. I mean, like Roland has his hypnotize like bullet thing, and we learned that he supposedly learned that from Martin before he knew Martin was bad. Or maybe even while he knew Martin was bad. But yeah, I mean, like we've seen magic in this world before, obviously. Like they're hopping between worlds. There's all kinds of crazy shit going on. But this feels like unique to me. This feels like almost we're in a fantasy specifically type of magic.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. 100%.
Yeah. So the lid on this box that contains this artifact in it has the shape of an eye on it, and it also has the motto in low speech, "I see who opens me," which is not at all ominous, Matt, not at all.
Yeah. So before we move on from the crystal ball that she can see distant things in, I mean, it's a Palantir. She's got a Palantir.
Yeah.
So, which, as soon as I saw that, I immediately just assumed that it had all of the properties of a Palantir from Lord of the Rings, and that it was like being guided by the evil force that rules. I'm just gonna start calling it the Crimson King because I don't know. It just seems like it's probably the Crimson King.
I mean, I don't want to link too many things together for you, but we know the symbol of the Crimson King is a big red eye.
Yeah.
And there's an eye on this box.
Right.
So I think the book is inviting you to make that connection.
Yeah. And I mean, also just like Sauron directed where the Palantir would look, and, you know, it all just matches up really well. So yeah, I mean, I was like, oh no, we're the eye of the Crimson King has entered the story. Basically, this is very bad.
Sure. So this eye, this Palantir, this rose glass that it's described as, isn't just powerful in certain ways. It also, just by holding the box, even before looking at it, she can feel its power, which in line with what this book series has done in the past, is attached to a certain kind of sexual lust. Like, she feels herself get aroused by just being near this thing. I think King writes here, did she feel a certain heat in that place where her ancient bow legs came together, a certain moisture in the dry creek which hid there? Gods. There is a whole lot, Matt, in the first part of Susan's story about sex and lust and desire. And I think it's interesting to kind of circle back to a conversation we had a few books ago about how King is choosing to depict and contrast the different sexual relationships, lust, the sexuality of all the characters. We'll see in this week's reading that Rhea's lust is almost explicitly compared to Susan's, because Rhea has this moment where she's aroused by this box. Susan has a moment by the end of this week's reading where just thinking of Roland arouses her. Here, Rhea's age and presumably wickedness have all but like killed her sex drive, but this otherworldly glass bauble seems to awaken it, kind of.
Yeah, we've read quite a lot since we last dug into this idea of like magic and sex being linked, and I want to take another stab at unraveling it because we've had some time. I'm coming to believe that whatever this dark force in the world is, it operates through people's base desires, which may be sexual, but may be really any kind of base desire. And I think this really connects up pretty well with our major theme of addiction. Because it's easy to get hooks into people through drugs or through sex or maybe through lust for power, and the dark forces in the story do seem to use those things not only as tools for getting a hold of people, but also just sort of directly in the course of taking actions and harming people.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting. I think it's interesting that he's set it up that way, but I also love the way in which it contrasts with our quote unquote good characters and how they are experiencing attraction and lust and sexual desire and all these things, because Susan is going through this as well. She finds herself at several times throughout this week's reading, feeling that same, King is almost really explicit in the way he describes their lust as a heat in that place, right? Like that is how King has described this feeling as a heat, an awakening, a desire in that place. And so because he describes it similarly for both Susan and Rhea, we're kind of forced to consider these two things together and to compare and contrast them. And I think the difference is here that Rhea's is motivated by this external source, by this otherworldly magical source, whereas Susan's is motivated primarily by our protagonist.
Yeah, I enjoy talking about this because I think I'm finding that I'm surprised at how interesting and complex King's conception of evil is. I think before I knew anything about King, I would have thought that this wasn't something that he thought too much about. Just like, oh yeah, I have monsters in my stories and monsters have got to be scary. But he actually seems to have a pretty well developed sense of like the nature of the evil in his stories. And so like you're pointing out exactly, when you have one character who's experiencing lust and it's cast as awful and evil and dark magic, and another character experiencing lust and it's healthy teenage, normal lust. that to me is sort of hinting at what how he's thinking about this. I don't feel like I have the answer yet. I feel like maybe you have to read more than just the Dark Tower to really understand. I don't know. It's very interesting to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is absolutely true that King uses sex and desire in his books to express these very, very same things that we're talking about in the Dark Tower, for sure. I think that is a commonality amongst Stephen King's viewpoint on these things. And so, yeah, maybe, once we're done with this whole project, we'll just go read all those other books and then we'll have a very clear understanding of this.
Sure, why not?
I think you're right that that's recorded now, Matt. Now you have to do it. I got you.
Sure, why not?
But yeah, I mean, I think that is absolutely what's going on here. And I totally agree with your statement. Like, yes, evil exists in Stephen King's universe, right? Like, this is not a universe in which we live in this moral grayness where it's like, well, no one's really evil, and evil exists, right? There is good, there is the light side, and there's the dark side, right? We have the white as a thing that exists here, which seems to be so far this pure goodness, and it must have a counterpart, and we've seen the Crimson King seems to be the champion of that counterpart. But just because this is a world in which there is clearly defined bad just because bad doesn't mean it can't be nuanced. Like, and I absolutely agree that that's what King is doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like we're definitely going to talk about this more as we go through the series. And I do really find it fascinating.
Yeah. So with her senses attuned thanks to the power of the orb, Rhea decides she has to get out of her disgusting house and goes to look at it under the kissing moon. The object is glowing it's this glowing rose-colored orb, and it not only revitalizes Rhea's sex drive, but her face. She looks younger in its glow. She kind of literally changes. And I like how King does this because at first the text just says, well, she looks younger. And I think the first time you read that in your mind, you're probably like, well, does she just feel younger, or just like in the reflection, like her face is younger? And then later Susan sees her looking into it again, and it's like, no, literally just it makes her look younger. That's literally what's happening.
Right. And
I think it's clever how King showed the same thing again from another perspective to really nail that down, that this is having physical changes to her look on just by being near this thing.
Yeah, it's a cool subtle way of showing how magical this thing is,
Yeah.
I mean, a Palantir doesn't do that. A Palantir is basically a telephone. It's FaceTime. Yeah. So this
is a little bit more complicated than a Palantir.
Yeah.
Because it also seems to have the not to add another Lord of the Rings metaphor onto yours, but it also seems to have like the desire and pull and corruption of the ring as well, because like she gets immediately jealous when she's looking at it and the cat comes over. Like, she's immediately jealous and guarding of the thing right away. And she so it seems to have some sort of like powerful draw, and desire attached to it.
Sure. And she decides that she just hates Susan because Susan's like slightly early and interrupts her orb time.
Right. One interesting thing I want to point out here is the words King uses to describe the orb. So he calls it rose-colored light. And then when she's looking at it further, it says the light in the globe seemed to furl up like petals. And I find this really interesting, Matt, because King made special time last week to remind us of Jake's rose in his empty lot. And now we are introduced to this mysterious magical artifact, and all the words King is using to describe it are very rosy.
Yeah, that really jumped out to me and kind of put me off balance, actually, because my first thought actually was like, well, maybe this is like a good team magical artifact that was stolen by the baddies. I mean, the Palantirs literally were made by the Numenorians and stolen by the baddies.
Sometimes I wonder what people who haven't read Lord of the Rings are thinking when you say these things.
They're probably confused, but they should just read Lord of the Rings because it's. I mean, it's amazing.
No, I agree with you.
But then I like that makes a certain amount of sense to me. But then I'm like, okay, well, Crimson King would be red, the color of roses. So maybe I'm just jumping the gun and assuming that roses equals red equals good in this story. I mean, Blaine was pink after all. So, but
Sure,
I mean, you're right that connecting it directly to like the petals of a rose is a major head scratcher for me. Honestly, I'm like, okay, well, why exactly make that specific connection?
I wonder, did it get you? So it seems to have gotten you to maybe think that, oh, maybe this thing is good. It didn't cast any shadow on whether our empty lot rose was as good and holy as the book made it seem.
For a second it did, but then I was like, I just don't think that's likely. But that thought entered my mind where I was like, well, maybe the rose is part of the Crimson King. But then I was like, but then like we have visions of like the steamroller or the God, I'm forgetting baby words, the bulldozer trying to kill the rose, and I'm like, okay, well, it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where like that could make any sense at all if the rose is actually bad. And I don't know. Now you're pulling me down a rabbit hole because Roland did say that could be a message sent as a kind of trick. So I don't know, man. I don't think that's what it is if I had to predict, but it did occur to me for a second.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't mean to put you down a rabbit hole. I was just kind of curious what your initial reaction was after making this connection.
Yeah.
Cool. So the glass suddenly shows Rhea a vision, like a Palantir. It shows her 3 riders heading toward Magus, who are, of course, we know are Roland and his 2 friends, Cuthbert and Elaine. A reminder for our listeners: I am saying Cuthbert. I am not saying the other word. I don't care how anyone else in this book pronounces it. It's Cuthbert. That's what it is, and it's what it's gonna be. It's Cuthbert.
Roger.
So just. I know you already were typing the email. I know you can put it away. So as Rhea is trying to figure out who these men are, however, Susan arrives early, and Rhea decides, as you mentioned earlier, that she hates her because of this. She hates her already because she interrupted her orb time. And as we close out on this chapter, Matt, I want to talk about kind of the story kind of metatextually for a bit, because King has chosen to begin the story of Roland and Susan Delgado through the point of view of the Wicked Witch of Magus, Rhea. And this is really interesting because we know that the framing device for the story within a story is that Roland is currently right now sitting around a campfire telling this story to his quartet. But the story itself begins from the point of view and contains events that Roland could not possibly be aware of. He was, even if he learned about, like, from Susan later about, like, what happened inside this witch's hut, like, the perspective of Rhea is not something he could ever be aware of. And it's a really interesting choice to do this because it makes a statement about what the story is going to be. It is not just going to be Roland retelling it. We're going to see the story from all angles.
Yeah, it's definitely worth talking about, I think. I mean, I wouldn't put it past Roland to just sort of psychically know all these details because it does seem like that's the sort of thing that happens constantly with the quartet.
Sure.
But I'm not saying that's what's happening, but also I don't think it really matters exactly. Like, King is mainly choosing this mode because it's the most dramatic way of doing it. It gives us dramatic irony by showing that Rhea has been shown Roland and his companions by the Palantir. And also it lets us know that Rhea has already decided that she hates Susan, which makes us much more concerned about everything that follows. Like, I just think this whole bit would not read the same at all if we just came in with Susan as she arrives at the hut. Like, it would almost, it works way better this way. So,
but here's a follow-up question: why not just start it with Roland arriving? Like, why not start it from Roland's point of view in the scene where he meets Susan at the side of the road? Like, you could definitely tell the story that way still.
Well, maybe. I mean, that's the thing, is I don't know where this is going exactly, but I suspect that this thing where she's set up this hypnotic code phrase or whatever in Susan's mind is going to be super important to how things evolve. And so setting that up properly was important. Now,
I don't disagree.
Yeah. So that's my reason. And also, I just feel like Rhea is going to be a character who's important to the story beyond, this point. And so this was introducing her made a lot of sense here. So,
yeah. No, and I love the way it kind of peels an onion, right? Like it makes logical sense to start with Roland, but instead we do the opposite. We start with Rhea, and then we meet Susan through Rhea's perspective. Then we meet young Roland through Susan's perspective. And it isn't until the final chapter of this week that we really just have a chapter that contains 3 different perspectives. We see from Roland's perspective, we see from Susan's perspective, and then we see from a brand new perspective, which is another one of our villains in Jonas. So it's kind of this week's reading is kind of bookended by the 2 of the antagonists with our protagonists in the middle. Mm-hmm. I think it's really cool.
Yeah. I didn't notice that exactly, but you're right. Yeah. Cool.
All right. So let's move on to chapter 2, Proving Honesty. One of the most disturbing chapters in this series so far, for sure. Uh-huh. It's just absolutely vile what happens in this hut. So as Rhea sprints back into her hut to hide the pink orb under her bed, we switch our point of view and finally get to meet the famed Susan Delgado. And she's wonderful, Matt. Like, I love her so much. We don't quite understand why Susan is here yet, but we already see King does such a great job of immediately showing how observant and clever and, like, aware she is. She's singing the song as she approaches the hut, and she sees Rhea dart back into her house, and we get this moment where there's actually a lot of moments in this chapter, Matt, where we see Susan's thoughts come out in italics. And King doesn't do this with every one of his characters. He does it very specifically with Susan a lot, though, where we're like very aware of her, surface level mind, like mental response to what's going on. And she sees here, like, as she sees Rhea dart back into the house, she thinks, don't stop singing. When an old lady hurries like that, she doesn't want to be seen. If you stop singing, she'll likely know she was. And it's really great. It's really great. So we know immediately, oh, this girl's smart. She's clever. She gets things.
Yeah, as I said at the start of the show, Susan is immediately likable and well drawn, and kind of impressive. Like, she's not just likable in the kind of like cheap, oh, she's perfect kind of way. Like she's a very specific character. She's a very specific person with a specific voice, and the situation that she's in is really interesting. And you're just immediately I was really shocked at how quickly I was just like on her side and cared about her and like wanted her to be okay, like immediately.
Sure.
Like, that's not easy, like writing wise,
Mm-mm. And I think circling back around to the conversation we just had, I think King choosing to introduce her apart from Roland was one of the smartest decisions he made, because we know her because of the hints we've gotten from Roland's stories in the past few books, right? But this is an entire chapter where it's just Susan dealing with Susan's problems, completely independent from Roland. So we learn who she is as an individual before we learn who she is as someone in love with our protagonist. And I think that's really important because it doesn't kind of cloud our understanding of her through the lens of Roland. We get to see her apart first.
Yeah.
It's really great.
Well, I agree, because what we do know about her through Roland is mostly these sort of flashes that center around his like longing for her, which is not really about her, So yeah, I think it was really important that we get to know her in this, tense situation that has nothing to do with him.
Sure.
One thing that's kind of stuck in my mind pretty much since we first heard the name Susan Delgado is just like what an Earth name that is. Like, I think I may have been mildly surprised to learn that Susan isn't from Earth, because like Susan is an English given name, and even more so than most of the Midworld names. Like, yeah, there are people like Stephen, but then there are names like Roland and Cuthbert, where those are clearly not names that you would normally hear. And then Delgado is like a Spanish, name.
It's just Spanish. Like,
yeah, it's just a Spanish name.
I think it means thin is the direct translation of it.
Yeah, I looked it up. I think that's basically right. But I guess I don't really have a point. Like, there's Jonas and DePape and other guy. And those are Earth names.
Reynolds
is an Earth name. Rhea is a mythology name. Roland is technically, a legendary name. I mean, I'm not sure what my point is, other than that, like, I was just thrown off guard by how normal Earth name Susan Delgado sounded, and then to find out, like, no, she's actually just this. She's kind of a peasant girl in this backwater of Midworld.
So I guess what you're saying is, when you first heard Roland talking about a person that he said was Susan, and then you learned that this book is going to, or the series of books is going to involve hopping between worlds a lot, your interpretation was, oh, she must come from Earth. She must come from our world, because that's such a name that would just be right at home in our world.
Or at least I felt that was likely, yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, wrong.
Yeah. Yep.
But no, I do think there is something there. It is interesting the way in which he uses names here, because like, we're going to come up, like, the mayor is named Thorin, and we're going to talk about him in a bit, but there is this very interesting mix of names that feel right at home in a Western. I think DePape is just a name that, like, that's got to be in some Western movie that I'm just not remembering right now, right? It just feels so at home in a Western. I actually think Delgado as a last name feels at home in a Western as well. But yeah, then you have these names like Thorin. You have the Rhea, which don't feel at home in this Western. They feel at home in something else. So it is interesting that the choices he's making here. And I think it matches this blending of genres and this blending of names.
Yeah, I like that explanation a lot, that he's intentionally bringing names in from different genres, basically. That's fun. Yeah, because I couldn't figure it out, but I think that makes a degree of sense. Okay.
Sure. So the song that Susan is singing and has been singing as she approaches the house is actually a really interesting one, Matt, because as we'll see later, it just so happens to be the same song that Roland starts whistling when they meet. Look at the lyrics, and it's really... It's not a good prognosis for what's going to happen here. So it's called the song is called Careless Love, and Susan sings, "Love, oh careless love, can't you see what careless love has done? Once my cares were far away, yes, once my cares were far away. Now my love has gone from me, and misery is in my heart to stay." Hey, Matt. Do you see why King started this book with a Romeo and Juliet quote yet?
I'm getting some clues. Actually at this point, I think I started to link up parallels, and I was like, so is Cuthbert Mercutio? And does that mean he's going to die here? But more generally, I mean, setting aside my tendency to maybe be overly literal with parallels, I do think we're getting some star-crossed lovers, maybe moon-crossed lovers in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I think moon crossed explicitly, like, right, the beginning of the story is the kissing moon, and we're kind of told that the demon moon, like, this whole thing sets up, like, once the demon moon comes, then you're going to sleep with him, and then as soon as you sleep with him, something is going to happen. Yeah. So, we kind of, like, the story seems to be bookended by these moons. So, yeah, moon crossed lovers, sure.
Cool.
So we finally learn that the reason Susan is early to her meeting with Rhea is because, despite being freaked out by being out in the middle of the night, which she just casually mentions the existence of werewolves, which we're like, wait, what? What?
Yeah.
And also being frightened about the task she's going to have to do tonight, she suddenly and inexplicably had the desire to just sprint full speed for like a mile. No casual stroll, just sprint through the countryside as fast as she can. And we kind of know, Matt, that this story ends in tragedy, though we're not exactly sure how just yet. And I do find it interesting the ways in which it seems like destiny, or Ka, if you want to call it that, is conspiring against or towards our young lovers, depending on the way you look at it. These chapters are filled with like these seemingly innocuous random chance moments that kind of sets everything on its path. What if Susan hadn't got the urge to run and had been on time, not early? What if the pink box hadn't magically and mysteriously like cracked its lid open a little bit under Rhea's bed, just letting a little bit of light glowing out of it? What would have happened if these things didn't suddenly and inexplicably occur, right?
Yeah, I mean, is it chance or is it Ka? Very, very ironic considering how she dismisses Ka as a superstition later. But yeah, I mean, clearly there will be terrible consequences from this meeting. That's all been set up. And, you get the sense that Rhea is somebody you can't help but inflict terrible consequences on everybody she meets.
Sure.
And like, again, it's like, so did Ka have this in store for Susan? In which case, Ka is not actually so nice. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, not only do we get clear that there are going to be terrible consequences here, but those consequences seem to be a result of external meddling, right? Like she suddenly wants to run, so she's there early. Therefore, Rhea doesn't have time to hide the orb back under the bed or back in its spot, so she has to put it under the bed. And then even more than that, it doesn't latch entirely closed because she doesn't have time to reactivate the lock on it, so it cracks itself open a bit. Then she exits the hut looking for firewood, and she turns the wrong way. She doesn't turn the way she's supposed to turn, so she happens upon a window in which she sees into the window and sees her holding up the orb and witnesses that. And it's just like these things that, like, just this coincidence upon coincidence upon coincidence, a chance occurrence that sends everything tumbling. And I think the cool thing about this is, I think, and you can correct me if I'm off base here, but I think even you, not knowing exactly how the story is going to end, can catch up on these things, because we do know going into this story that it's a tragedy. We do know going into the story that it ends in Susan's death. Like, we know that because that, like, the previous books have explicitly told us that.
Yeah.
He says he watched her die, or he saw her die. And so, like, this is him messing with this concept of Ka and this concept of chance occurrences or destiny or whatever you want to call it. And he gets to kind of show these cause and effect chains that are happening, and we don't know how it all goes down, but we can kind of still catch on to those little moments.
Yeah. I honestly, these little moments hadn't stood out to me so much, but now that you've drawn my attention to it, it's definitely clear that he's sort of setting up the Rube Goldberg machine nature of the situation, where it's like, if only this thing hadn't happened, it could have all been averted. And it's just it's all a comedy of errors, I suppose. I think he is doing that on purpose here, but I can't say that I really noticed it until you pointed it out to me. But yeah, I agree.
Cool. So any happiness that Susan felt from singing and running through the night is quickly squashed when Rhea invites her in and then immediately insults her dead dad. So we've seen now that Susan is clever, she's tough, and most importantly, she has not forgotten the face of her father, both literally and figuratively here. And I that's such a nice touch that, like, we've attached this idea of forgetting the face of your father as this most important thing. And then we see that Susan is a character who loved her father dearly and is still really not over his death.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the more touching parts of her character that makes her likable, is how often she thinks about her father and seems to have, like, really absorbed his lessons.
Yeah. And she's strong, too. I love this passage right here. The hag, meanwhile, was watching Susan shrewdly, her bunched knuckle hands planted on her hips while her cat twined around her ankles. Her eyes were rheumy, but Susan saw enough of them to realize that they were the same gray-green shade as her cat's eyes, and to wonder what sort of fell magic that might be. She felt an urge, a strong one, to drop her eyes, and would not. It was all right to fear, but sometimes a very bad idea to show it. I'm so happy we get to talk about Susan Delgado, Matt, because I just love it. I love it. Like, this is this clear moment where she sees this otherworldly Rhea whose eyes match her cat's, and she won't look down. She won't look away. She won't do the cowardly thing because she knows she has to show strength here, and she does.
Yeah, right. It becomes even more impressive when it becomes clear how young she is. It's just like, this she's awesome.
Yeah, we should say here Susan is 16 years old, which is kind of crazy. Susan, in this story, Susan is 16 and Roland is 14. So it's madness.
Yeah,
so young. I think the first time I read these, I didn't quite process how young these kids were.
Yeah.
But now that I'm in my mid 30s, like they're babies. They're babies.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's the kind of thing where, like, I guess I'm thinking that this story is going to take place over a relatively short period of time, but just like it also just feels like it feels like it ought to take place over a longer period of time, like, because it's weird for me to think that Roland was only 14 when all these events happened. I don't know. I guess I'm probably just wrong about that, but yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. I mean, we will see. I mean, I think while Roland is only 14, I think Roland is always kind of like an old soul type of person, you know,
Sure.
like he always, like even 14-year-old Roland in this book, like kind of goes back and forth between totally acting like he's 14 and also acting like someone who's much older. So I think it makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, even when he's acting like a kid, he's not acting like a 14-year-old kid, and I'm fine with that because it's Roland.
Sure. I'm also attaching a 14-year-old 21st century American concept to this idea. When I hear 14, that's what I think of, and not a 14-year-old kid growing up in whatever in Midworld.
Right.
Like that's you're gonna have a very different level of maturity and understanding, and like it's just gonna be different.
Yeah, we haven't been trained as gunslingers since infancy, so
Sure. I love just how like disgusted by Rhea Susan is here, Matt. Like the details in which King describes her hideousness from Susan's perspective is just, it's wonderful. I really love it. Like that moment where she bites down on the gold and like the description of what her teeth look like and what the whole, it's so gross. And the part where she kind of just casually touches her and causes her to shudder uncontrollably. It's such good detail. I really like it.
Yeah, I agree.
And then also that shuddering also kind of, you know, connects plot line wise because Rhea picks up on that, and she already hated Susan for being early, and that really kind of seals the deal for Susan, right? Is this shuddering she did? She's disgusted by her, and she let it slip that she is. Yeah,
right. I mean, that kind of amplifies until the end of the chapter, where her disgust at Rhea is what cements her decision to plant this hypnosis thing in her mind.
So Susan eventually does see the glowing pink from under the bed, and it appears at least that Rhea notices that she's noticed it because she like immediately sends her outside to get firewood for the fire, and while she's doing that, she finishes hiding the box back in its rightful place. As we talked about before, Susan just so happens to turn the wrong way and find herself on the side of the house with a window, and so she gets to see Rhea get the orb out from under the bed, and this is where we get this wonderful part where we see through Susan that her face is actually getting young. And the writing here, Matt, her face was flooded with soft pink radiance, and Susan gasped. For one moment, it was the face of a young girl, but one filled with cruelty as well as youth. The face of a self-willed child determined to learn all the wrong things for all the wrong reasons. The face of the girl this hag had once been, mayhap. And I like, you know, it's just so funny. Like, it's not, she becomes this youth, this innocent youth when she looks into the thing. You're still the same person. And I wonder if that speaks to the fact that Rhea through time has gotten worse, but was always kind of this way. You know, we talk about King's perception of evil, and evil is bad. Like there is just evil that exists in this world. It doesn't need an explanation. And it seems like this person, even as a young girl, was always cruel, was always bad, was always going to end up this person.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It does. It also reminds me a bit of the best Disney movie in recent memory, Tangled, where the wicked stepmother, or actually she's just a witch, basically the wicked witch, continually makes herself look young and beautiful. Using the hair magic, but she is always clearly still an evil monster, you know, regardless of the fact that she looks beautiful now.
Sure. Well, in The Little Mermaid, when Ursula makes herself look like
that too,
young brute, like she's still. I mean, how they did it in that movie was just make her have black hair because that's code for evil. Apparently, black, you can't have black hair. But she does, like the way they animated her. Her features are sharper and more fierce. Like they're just like they're just like, they put cruelty on her face still, even if she's this beautiful woman.
Yes.
And that's kind of what I imagine when I read this part, right?
I agree. Yeah. I mean, definitely playing with the trope there, but also going beyond the trope, because it's, you can imagine this kind of puckered child face.
Yeah.
I think when Susan sees the light, it actually made me worried, because the orb, the box does say, "I see those who see me," right? So it's like, oh, okay, well, maybe the eye saw her when she saw the light.
Interesting. Yeah, could be. I think the most important part about this is she sees the hiding spot, right? Like, she sees Rhea put the glass in her secret hiding spot. And so she's observed all this now. She knows that this orb exists, and she knows that Rhea has put it in this place. So that's some information that Susan has that might be dangerous for her to have. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I love how Rhea putting the glass back in its place is described, though. Like, she's doing the little minor touch that King does here, that she's doing all of this while still carrying the drawstring that had the gold pieces that Susan paid her, like, hanging from her mouth still. It's just, this is an image that actually Susan attaches onto later when thinking about Rhea and thinking about how disgusted she is by her, because it upsets her so much. And I think it's because, like, it's just so, it's kind of like animalistic, right? Like, she's holding something by her mouth and not her hands. It's kind of like a beast. Yeah. Not a human. And I don't know. It's just this little tiny touch that I think adds so much to this scene. Yeah, it's definitely a sort of uncivilized thing to do. Yeah. I think this scene also works on a really dramatic level, because we now know that Rhea has seen another vision that we're not privy to. Or maybe, I think I'm interpreting this right. Like, she goes to put away the orb, and then the next time Susan sees her, she seems preoccupied. And my interpretation is she saw another vision, maybe more of the same vision that we saw earlier, maybe a different vision. I mean, for all we know, she saw Susan, spying on her. But but who knows, though? I mean, I think we'll probably find out. Obviously, Evil Force wants to make her aware that Roland is coming, so that's one thing. But yeah, I'm excited to see where else this goes. Cool. All right. So Susan gets back inside with the firewood, and we finally find out what this meeting is all about. The mayor of Hambry, a man named Thorin, has not had any luck getting his wife pregnant, and he's asked the 16-year-old Susan if she'll be his mistress, get pregnant, and produce an heir for him, basically to be his Gilly, as the book describes it. So she's going to Rhea, as the title of the chapter says, to prove her honesty, aka prove that she is a virgin. And we've gotten, Matt, little peeks at the culture of Roland's Midworld in the past, but I think that this arrangement is one of the clearest indicators of what life is like here, especially for women. This whole scene is super disturbing, especially for poor young Susan, but it strikes me as something that's just kind of fairly standard in Midworld. Not only the proving, but the arrangement that she's having to undertake. Like, this seems to me like this is just something that you have to do. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very clear that this is not the first proving that Rhea has done, nor will it be the last. Absolutely. Yeah. It seems like this is their culture. This does not seem like Thorin is especially monstrous, considering the distribution of the types of men that exist in this world. Which makes it almost more monstrous, right? Like, if you could just say, oh, well, this dude's evil, then you could at least feel good about it. But he seems we haven't actually met the man yet, but he seems from descriptions as just like an average dude in power in this world. Yeah. And this is what dudes in power in this world do. And I love, like, we kind of already touched on this, but the moments where, Susan sells this as just like an arrangement to produce an heir. Like, I'm just going to get pregnant. Everyone has babies. Like, every woman has a baby. I can handle this. It'll be fine. And then Rhea, like, immediately crushes that whole vision in her mind. Pish tush, spare me the called swallow and pretty words. He wants tits and arse that don't squish in his hands, and a box that'll grip when he pushes. If he's still man enough to push, that is. If a son come of it, aye, fine. He'll give it over to ye to keep and raise until it's old enough to school, and after that you'll see it no more. If it's a daughter, he'll likely take it from ye and give it to his new man, the one with the girl's hair and the limp, to drown in the nearest cattle wallow. So this is like, again, brutal honesty from Rhea, but also probably accurate, right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. You know, it's fascinating because like Rhea's hate of men is strong enough that it overrides her hate of Susan, and she accidentally gives Susan some straight, if extremely harsh, advice.
Yeah.
I mean, what she says to Susan is true, I think, and it serves to sort of get Susan thinking much more practically and realistically than she had been before. And I mean, yeah, it's just really interesting that in the course of being unnecessarily cruel to her, Rhea provided her some pretty potentially helpful objective insight.
Yep. Fairy, wicked witch, godmother.
I'm also, you know, the thing is, like, I'm thinking it's helpful, but it's like, well, maybe it would have been better for, you know, in the end, maybe it would have been better for Susan to still be deluded, rather than to have all these doubts, which are then going to lead her into her death, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess you could argue that feeling doubtful about the nature of the thing allows her to perhaps more enthusiastically embrace whatever is going on with Roland than it would have if she was still delusioned by the idea that this is going to be a simple transaction and then I'm just going to carry on with my life.
Yeah. That's what I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So then we get to the most disturbing part, Matt. Rhea has Susan strip, examines her, and then basically begins to rape her. I think if we didn't already hate Rhea of the Coups, this would absolutely do it for us. Yeah. I think presumably we can guess that this is a result of the lust that the pink orb has like lit in her, but it's awful. It's disgusting. It's really gross. It's really bad.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is yet more of the stuff I was talking about when I said that, like, you're just constantly on edge during this part because you don't know what she's going to do. You don't really understand why exactly. And you're just so, like, you feel like you're reading the perspective of some kind of monstrous animal that might just like snap and bite someone's head off or something. But like somehow it manages to be worse than that. Yeah.
It's awful. Like there are not many moments I've read so much Stephen King that there are not many moments that make me like visibly uncomfortable, but reading this part again definitely got me there. It's bad. It's bad. But Susan stops it, right? Like once again, Susan, I think, shows her strength here where she says, "Be still and on your feet before I kick you into the fire, unnatural thing." And then she kind of uses Thorin's disappointment at harming her as a way of stopping the assault and getting her out of there, which I think it's really interesting because on the one hand, you're like, fuck yeah, like tell her, don't let her do that to you, tell her. And then there's this little beat where it's like, she recognizes, or at least the text recognizes, that this is the first time she's used the threat of a man to protect herself. And it won't be the last. And there's something kind of heartbreaking in that as well, that the only reason she is able to negotiate her way out of this situation and allowing herself to push back against Rhea as strongly as she did is because she's got the protection of a powerful man behind her words. And there's something absolutely heartbreaking about that realization in her.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you consider the context that at a certain point, she's going to be in a situation where, you know, Roland is the only person who could have protected her and he fails to. At least that seems to be the direction the story's going. Yeah, and of course, it probably pisses Rhea off way more than it otherwise would have for her to use the threat of a man against her, given Rhea's feelings about men.
Sure, yeah. But it works because she knows that there will be consequences, and Rhea declares Susan proved and writes it down on an old slip of what turns out to be like a Citgo notebook.
Like from a gas station, right?
Yeah, exactly. And she writes it down. I copy pasted the actual text from the book for you because I know I know you're listening to the audiobook where she writes down honest, but it's spelled Onnest, which I thought was like an interesting choice, right? Like we have this Rhea as the super powerful person who has just assaulted our character, and she can't spell.
Yeah.
Like it's just this really, like, I mean, I think Roland has already demonstrated that like paper is precious in this world, so people just don't write stuff down very much. So it kind of makes sense. But it is like this moment of like, I think like it is stripping away power from Rhea, at least in the reader's eyes, because it infantilizes her a little bit.
Yeah, and I think this is again one of those little touches that humanizes her. Yeah, I did not know about the spelling, but like, yeah, it's in pretty bad handwriting. It's spelled wrong, and yeah, I like the idea that people in Midworld are probably just generally illiterate. I mean, it's interesting because this could be way more literacy than average,
sure,
but still, you're right that for us, it makes her seem a little bit diminished.
Yeah, but I mean, we will say that Susan can clearly read because she's able to read it. And I think the text takes special attention to say it took her a while before she understood it, right? Because she's looking at it and like Onnest, I think it'd take a while before your brain says, oh, you're trying to write honest. Yeah. Oh, I get it. And so not only can Susan read, but presumably she reads better than Rhea.
Yeah, it seems like it. Yeah.
And she is not that. I mean, I guess her family is a little bit like more powerful than the average Hambry family because her dad was the, I forget what the term is, the horse master or whatever.
Yeah.
Took care of all the horses for the mayor. So I think they're like a little bit better off relatively probably to the average family in this world. But still, like the fact that can read seems pretty significant, I think.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, kind of upper middle class, maybe. But of course, in the according to the genre tropes, with her fortunes in decline, and desperately needing to find some way of saving them.
Yeah, and of course she leaves her mark as well. Rhea does, and it is what's the mark look like, Matt?
It's a pitchfork.
So how did the audiobook describe it? I think there might be lines in the text that actually say it looks like a pitchfork.
No,
I don't remember.
I don't think the audiobook described it at all. Really, it was just a mark. I didn't really have a sense of what it looked like until you put the picture here. Okay, which I mean, cool. It kind of also could be construed as an X, which is usually like the mark that people make when. Sure. But that doesn't Rhea say something like nobody can copy this mark?
Yes.
And to me, I'm like, oh, so it's like a magical sigil that you can't copy or you burst into flames or something.
Right. Yeah. We have to attach some magic to it because I could very easily copy this thing that I'm looking at on the screen right now.
Yeah. I mean, overall though, having, basically almost finishing up with the Rhea part, everything about the encounter just makes Rhea so dangerous and awful and hateable. It's really quite remarkable how it all comes together.
Yeah, I don't think we're supposed to feel very conflicted in our hate of Rhea by the end of this whole thing. Despite those little moments of humanity that you and I have talked about already, I still think she's pretty despicable. I think sexually assaulting your main character has a way of doing that to a character.
Well, I think that King puts those moments of humanity in there not to make us sympathize with her, but just to make us not be bored with her, because she is, to make her a real person.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like even Jack Mort had his moments of like, well, he's a human, that makes it even scarier when you realize this is a person like you instead of some distant thing that you have no relation to. So while we're on the topic of Thorin, the name Thorin is the major character in The Hobbit. It's the dwarf king Thorin Oakenshield. I just think it's interesting because King has obviously made so many Lord of the Rings homages, but I think this might be the first proper noun that he's just borrowed straight up from one of the books. And I mean, the guy doesn't seem to be a bearded dwarf. He just seems like kind of a dumb functionary. So
yeah. Well, do you know if Thorin is like was created by Tolkien? I don't actually know. I mean, I'm guessing it's like a Norse name, right? Like it literally has Thor in it.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that, you know, all of his names are like derived from the languages. Mm-hmm. And all of his, you know, is Thorin, son of Thror and Thrain and all these other names like that are.
I do think the dwarves have a very kind of Norse-ish like look to them, right? Like the dwarven runes look kind of like Norse, and I think all the dwarven names are kind of because even Thorin, son of Thrain, like Thane is a Norse god as well. Yeah. So
I think that the Tolkien actually did more or less explicitly base different languages on different existing languages. Mm-hmm. and sure, I don't remember reading whether Dwarvish was based on Norse, but that would make total sense. I mean, what's his name? Tolkien. God, why, Matt? Tolkien was like a scholar of that particular thing exactly. In fact, I don't know. That's a whole fun rabbit hole I could go into. But
sure.
There's this thing where like he actively avoids using the English words that come from French. Not, I think, just because like he hates the French, but like because he is trying to sort of adhere more toward the English words that come from the Norse words.
Right.
Know?
Well, and I mean the framing device for both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is that these are books written by people in that world, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
And he the author is only like serving as almost like a translator or a reteller of those same stories. So that, I mean, that has a certain logic to it.
Sure.
But we've gone way off track here. I think the important thing of you bringing this up though is that it is an interesting choice, that whether King is explicitly borrowing from The Hobbit or explicitly borrowing from a kind of like Scandinavian type of deity name or name attached to deity. This is a very strong name given to a character who, you know, from what we've seen described, and I think Susan describes him a little bit more in detail in the next chapter, doesn't seem to fit. And it kind of complicates the conversation we were having about like this mix of names that seem at home in a Western and names that seem at home in a fairy tale. And then we have Thorin. No spoilers, but you're not going to see Thorin and say Thorin. That's not what's going to happen.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. I like the idea that, you know, it's like naming somebody Thor in our world.
Right.
Like I've known at least one. Yeah. It's like, who can live up to that name?
Mm-hmm. Nobody.
Of course, my name means
Chris Hemsworth.
Gift from God. So, you know, names are weird.
We know. My name means a person from Scotland.
Person from Scotland, which you're not actually.
I'm not. So I've ruined it. So you're not a gift from God, and I'm not from Scotland. That's just the way things work, Matt.
Well, let's not be too hasty.
So before she leaves, though, she tells Susan that Thorin is not to sleep with her until the demon moon rises, which we are told is 3 months from now. We're not exactly sure why, Matt, but Susan is kind of excited at the prospect of more time away from her fate, just in time for a young gunslinger to enter her life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think maybe circling back to, you know, what you were talking about a little bit earlier, perhaps the information that she gleaned in the orb while Susan was looking from out the window is why she made this choice, because we see nothing in Rhea's point of view from the earlier chapter that would make her make this decision. This is something that kind of just comes out of nowhere from our perspective.
Yeah.
So it could have something to do with that. We don't know.
Yeah. That's one fun thing about the whole bit is how Rhea is saying and doing things when we're not in her point of view, and we cease to understand why she's saying and doing those things. That makes us even more worried. So yeah, cool.
All right, so chapter 3 is called A Meeting on the Road, and it contains a meeting on the road.
Okay.
The chapter begins with Susan walking back to Hanbury from Coos Hill, and she's kind of thinking about her life and thinking about the pledge that she is just entering into, that she's just made. And here we have, I think, one of the most amazing bits of characterization I've seen in the book so far. I'm just going to read this whole thing because it's really good. The thing that troubled her most as she made her way back towards the town was her new understanding of the compact she had made. It was good to have a reprieve, months yet before she would have to live up to her end of the bargain. But a reprieve didn't change the basic fact. When the demon moon was full, she would lose her virginity to Mayor Thorin, a skinny, twitchy man with fluffy white hair rising like a cloud above the bald spot on the top of his head, a man whose wife regarded him with a certain weary sadness that was painful to look at. Hart Thorin was a man who laughed uproariously when a company of players put on an entertainment involving head-knocking or pretending punching or rotten fruit throwing, but who only looked puzzled at a story which was pathetic or tragic. A knuckle-cracker, a backslapper, a dinner-table belcher, a man who had a way of looking anxiously towards his chancellor at almost every word, as if to make sure he hadn't offended Reimer in some way. Oof, what a description, Matt. Like, I don't know how King does what he does when he does shit like this. Like, there's nothing particularly like magical and new in this writing, and yet I understand Hart Thorin so completely from this. Like, I've got him.
Yeah, I mean, he's a master of archetypes, even for archetypes that you didn't know had archetypes. Like, just I mean, it's all great, but even if you just take a knuckle cracker, a backslapper, a dinner table belcher, that by itself, you're like, all right, I'm halfway there, and then the rest of it is just further detail, you know. And
it's interesting because I think that alone is kind of Thor-y, or at least modern depictions of Thor, you know, like of this like carefree, like just wants to have fun, get drunk, and slap people on the back type person, but a man who had a way of looking anxiously towards his chancellor at almost every word, as if to make sure he hadn't offended him. That does not seem very Thor, God of Thunder-y, right? Yeah. That seems like a person completely uncertain of themselves, a coward. And it's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, also it just makes like the fact that he'll laugh at like childish comedy and then just seem kind of perplexed by any other sort of emotion just makes him seem dumb.
Yeah, super dumb. Yeah,
we'll see how he comes out in person, I guess. But right now, my impression of him is that he's just very dumb.
Yeah. But we finally learn the reason that Susan has entered into this deal. She hopes it will allow her to keep the lands that used to be owned by her father, or at least own them outright, right? Because the idea is she's going to get a lot of money, and with that money, she'd be able to like buy that land and just own it outright. And also, her aunt Cordelia, who's a new character that we meet in this section, has influenced her about wanting a baby around a house. And we see that maybe the naivety about what the mayor will want from her comes from her aunt. Her aunt is not as world aware as Rhea of the Coos is, clearly.
Well, either that or when we finally meet her aunt, my impression was more like I think her aunt is just going to use her. Potentially, like her aunt may be way more cynical than even Susan is willing to believe.
Sure,
because it's hard to believe that your aunt would do something like that to you. Sacrifice you basically.
Yeah, I mean, I love the part where it's basically like she used the fact that Susan like loved playing with dolls and has not too long ago left the doll phase of her life, and wouldn't she just love another doll that she could dress up and feed and play with? It seems like that's blatant manipulation there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But in her distraction of these thoughts, Susan doesn't notice the man on horseback approaching from behind her until he's right there. This man introduces himself as Will Dearborn. And Matt, I'm curious just exactly how long it took for you to realize that this was Roland. Was it immediately?
Immediately, yeah.
But no, it's Will Dearborn, Matt. It's not.
Yeah, no, I wasn't thrown off.
And part of me wonders if you're supposed to be, because I agree with you. I think, like, first of all, the chapter's titled A Meeting on the Road. I don't think it's going to be Susan meeting some random dude. but it is interesting, like the way it's structured, that we don't get like textual confirmation on who this is until the next chapter, until we jump into Roland's head. And it's like, this is Roland. But also King treats it as an assumed fact by that point, right? It's not like Will Dearborn walked up to his friend who said, "Hello, Roland." And the text is like, dun, dun, dun. Like, King knows that you know, because we're not idiots.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it would have been really weird if we got through the whole Will Dearborn part and then it was like, Will Dearborn galloped down the road having just met Susan. You'd just be like, what? No, it was Roland. I mean,
sure.
I think it's, I don't know. I think he knows. I think that it's just so obviously a young Roland.
Sure.
He does and says all of the things that you would expect a young Roland to say. And there's so much of it where it's just obvious. Like, yeah, he's clearly a gunslinger. He keeps dipping for his guns. He has his pack all tied down properly. Like, it's just clues upon clues upon clues.
Sure. Yeah. I do think it kind of reminds me of The Gunslinger, in which like we were with Roland for an entire chapter before we actually got his name. Mm-hmm. And this way we're with him for an entire chapter before we get his real name versus his fake name.
True.
So Will and Susan chat with each other, and I love these little bits where she can almost tell immediately that he's from the Inner Baronies because he talks different. He says yes instead of I, which is just a beautiful little bit of detail. Like, we can't hear these people speak, right? I mean, you can, but I can't hear these people speak. And so, like, this is a way, I think, beyond just word choices, that we can kind of gather that Susan probably has a little bit of an accent and Roland probably does not have that same accent. He talks more formally, and he probably talks with a little bit less of an accent. I imagine Susan with like a little bit of a drawl to her. And I think the dialogue itself kind of matches that.
And the audiobook does a perfect job of this, where Susan has like a slight sort of charming lower class accent. Mm-hmm. And Roland has always consistently had the kind of stiff accent that it's interesting that I would have just contextualized it as like he's a very serious, Western gunslinger guy. But also when you throw in the your father's sake stuff, it does start to sound like a kind of high court lordly speech.
Sure.
What's also great about the voice actor is that all of the Rhea stuff is like, yes, my pretty, like it's really quite extreme in the direction of doing a character voice, and I love it. It's perfect. It's so good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to talk for a little bit about Roland here, because I think this is actually like one of those sneakily challenging things that King has to do, because I think you need to create a character who both is and isn't the guy we recognize, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we need to be able to tell that this is still Roland, but he's also a 14-year-old kid. He's still a kid who has his whole life ahead of him. He's felt setbacks and anger at his mother and Martin and all this stuff, but the quest for the tower hasn't gripped him yet. He's not a person that has seen the horrors of the world yet and been changed by it. And I think King manages to get that across here in a chapter that we're not even seeing from his perspective, because we see this kid who's so proper, who's like calling her Sai over and over again to the point that it annoys her. That he's prim and proper and Roland, but he also it's also in a way where he's a boy playing at being a man for like the first time in his life, and he's going out of his way to be like proper and gentlemanly to this attractive woman he's just happened upon. Mm-hmm. And I just find it so interesting that all this comes across where we're not even in his head. We know Roland enough, even present day Roland, that we still can kind of guess at what's going on in young Roland's head throughout all these moments where it's like, this is beautiful girl you're seeing, and she's like chatting with you, and she gets up on the horse and her skirt kind of flips up for a moment, and you're just like, oh, Roland definitely saw that. Uh-huh. It's really fun, I think, and I think he captures Roland very, very well in this young kid. I still see the character I know in him.
Yeah. Oh, me too. Totally. Right. Yeah. It's so fun because, like you said, there's immaturity. There's a lot of carefreeness and kind of, complete lack of the like laser focused, to the degree of being almost unsettling that we have in our modern Roland, but a lot of the other traits are there. So
yeah.
So Susan at first declined Dearborn's offer to ride atop her horse, but she eventually decides to accept it because she's I think she's trying to resist like the looks. She's trying to resist the feeling she's having, and she's trying to resist the resistance to the feeling she's having by like proving something to her. So she's like, I'm going to get on top of the horse. And then as she does that, the whistling begins. And the whistling, as we talked a little bit earlier, is Roland whistling the same song that Susan was singing as she walked up to Rhea's house. And so immediately we're like, uh-oh. And I think Susan is like, uh-oh as well. And we see her father's voice appear in her head, which is, again, something that King has done through Roland a lot, and Eddie. Like, all these characters in this book have their voices from their past appear in their head. And here's for Susan, it's her father, and her father says, "Mayhap it's Ka, girl," her father's voice whispered. "No such thing," she thought right back at him. "I'll not see Ka in every passing wind and shadow like the old ladies who gather in green heart of a summer's evening. It's an old tune. Everyone knows it." "Mayhap better if you're right," Pat Delgado's voice returned. "For if it's Ka, it'll come like the wind, and your plans will stand before it no more than my dad's barn stood before the cyclone when it came." So I think this is really cool, Matt, because we've basically always seen Ka through Roland's perspective. Roland, who is a guy who's basically assumed, at least when we meet him, that Ka is just a thing, and it's controlling everything, and I'm a slave to it, and it will happen if Ka wills it. And then we have a character here, Susan, who basically comes across that concept and is like, no, that's bullshit. I don't believe in that. And I think it introduces this idea that Roland's like adherence to this religious adherence to this thing is perhaps not as commonly held in this world as we thought. Though she's wrong here, right? Like, she's explicitly wrong here.
Yeah, it seems like, Susan isn't like the destined protagonist, and so she hasn't had Ka's thumb on her entire life. But maybe for Roland, it's just much more obvious that Ka is real because he's always getting pushed around by it.
Yeah.
And also probably like gunslingers talk about Ka more in general.
True. Yeah.
I mean, I like the idea. I like how Susan is yet another character who has, the voice of her father in her mind, explicitly talking to her almost. Mm-hmm. And here her father is not really letting her get away with this. Like, she's saying, it's no such thing. And then the quote unquote voice of her father, which is obviously her own imagination, says, if it is Ka, then you won't have any choice in the matter.
Yeah.
So it's like she believes, but she doesn't believe,
Yeah, I love the expression, if it is Ka, it'll come like the wind, which is kind of exactly what's happening here.
Yeah.
So we learn that there are Citgo oil fields outside of Hambry. So that's cool.
Citgo, the brand that we recognize. Yes.
Yeah. And some of them are even still working, Matt. 19 of them, to be exact, which is not a number that matters at all. Roland reveals that they're in Hambry to be counters for the affiliation. This is basically the government that exists in the baronies, to take stock of the town, including the oil derricks, and report back to the affiliation on what everything is. This isn't entirely true, Matt, and we know this,
right?
But Roland also has like a cover story on top of the cover story where he says they've been sent out here as punishment by their fathers for helling, is what Susan calls it. And the funny thing I like about this, Matt, is both of these cover stories have a bit of truth to them, right? They are here to kind of just check and see what's going on in this town. And they are here because Roland did a thing and his dad got mad at him for it. But the real purpose is because he's in danger, because he's just put a target on his back, and his father's worried that Martin is going to come after him. So he's trying to get out of Martin's way. So like, I think it's interesting the way they've kind of built this cover story on half-truths, not complete lies.
I also think it's interesting because we just had this story beat last week where Eddie is like, yeah, you lie when it suits your purpose, and which is absolutely true here, because it's interesting because he's lying to this woman who is presumably the great love of his life, perhaps, and not really feeling bad about it at all.
Sure.
Like at no point when we get back to his head is he like he regretted having to lie to the girl. I don't think.
Yeah.
It's just and like pragmatically, it's a life or death thing. So it's not that he needs to feel bad about lying here. It's just like if he feels like they have a thing going, then he should want to be honest with her.
Right. Like starting your entire thing with a foundation of dishonesty is not. It's not great.
Yes.
But I think like the funny thing about this is I think both of these people can feel the attraction to each other, but neither of them wants it. They both recognize this is bad. Like Roland is not here to fall in love with a woman. Susan is promised to someone else. This cannot be, and yet they can't help it.
Yeah.
And to kind of continue our Romeo and Juliet comparison here, when Romeo and Juliet first meet each other, she is not aware that he is a Montague. She does not know who he is yet, and does not learn his true name until later, and who he is and why he's here or why he snuck in and what that means until a little bit later. So that fits with that as well.
Good point. That wasn't Lord of the Rings related, so I missed it.
I do like there is this moment where I think once again we kind of show Susan's insight here, where Roland says, "Let me be honest with you," he said, and for the first time she thought she heard a false note in there. Perhaps it was only her imagination. Certainly she had little experience in the world. Aunt Cord reminded her of this almost daily, but she had an idea that people who set on by saying, "Let me be honest with you," were apt to go on by telling you straight-faced that rain fell up, money grew on trees, and babies were brought by the Grand Featherex. Which is not. Like, what is that?
It's the magical stork of Midworld.
Yeah, but
it's great. It's once again the kind of a small thing that lets us know that Susan is way smarter than your average 16-year-old.
Yeah. Do you think is Roland just not that good at lying yet? Is this meant to show Susan's skill at telling falsehood, or Roland's naivete at telling lies?
Well, potentially both. I mean, I think when I was 16, I didn't know that if somebody said, "Let me be honest with you," they were probably going to lie. I think I do know that now, but
I'm just learning that right now. So, seriously? How many people have lied to me?
I mean, everyone all the time.
Do you ever notice in like work meetings when like someone is like, I had a boss who liked to use the word candidly a lot, and he'd go like, candidly, blah, blah, blah. And I was always like, does that mean you weren't being candid before this moment?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm always conscious of these phrases that I use too, where I'll be like, between you and me. And then I'm like, that just makes me seem like I'm conniving all the time. Like I'm saying things that are like, what, just speak normal. But I do it all the time. I think it's very hard. Yeah. It's hard to break out of these sort of tics.
I think we should use the phrase "between you and me" on this podcast because that's some delicious irony.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Every episode. Okay, good.
Yeah. So Susan's very intelligent and smart. I think you're right. I think it's supposed to maybe play in that both ways a little bit.
Yeah.
In that she is very observant, but he's also kind of new to this whole thing. Because again, I think he's 14 years old. He's not a gunslinger yet. Like he passed the test way earlier than he should have. And he's kind of, I think the phrase "playing at adulthood" is perfect for him here.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, definitely. 14, I was a baby when I was 14.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. So Susan realizes that Will and his friends will be dining at the mayor's house either tomorrow or a day in the future, and makes him promise that he must pretend to be meeting her for the first time. And Matt, she's like extremely worried about this fact, repeating it multiple times and making sure. He's like, as she says goodbye to him at the end of the scene, she's like, "Hey, now, please, make sure the first time you meet me is going to be, you can't say you know me." And I think it already like shows the way she's feeling. It already like represents this air of forbiddenness in this exchange already. Like it's already kind of gone she doesn't even know who he is yet, and it's already gone to Montague Capulet territory, because like she already recognizes, oh, this could be dangerous.
Yeah, I think she feels the pull of this thing even before anything has really happened.
Yeah. And sometimes I just want to point out King's writing and be like, yes, this is perfect. She pointed a little way down the slope at a dark shape which overhung the road on a chain. Do you see that? Yes. He heaved a large and rather comical sigh. Is it the object I fear beyond all others? Is it the dread shape of Mrs. Beach's mailbox? Aye, and it's there we must part. It's like perfect. It's like just perfect. I love young horny Roland.
Yes.
Is it the object I fear beyond all others? The dread shape of Mrs. Beach's mailbox.
Yeah, I mean he's being funny here, right? This is sort of the hints of the younger, more relaxed, jocular Roland that we see, like mild hints of. Totally. You know, I think we begin to understand that Roland did used to be a lot more like that, and life has just crushed him down into this, you know, serious person that he is now. Yeah.
Yeah, and at this very moment, the wind shifts, and Roland, for the first time, hears the sound of the Thinny that has taken up residence in the Eyebolt Canyon just outside of town. We get this little bit where she says the Thinny has been here before Susan was born, and its awful warbling noise has just kind of become a fact of life in the town. Like they have a tradition around it. They burn living plant life at a certain time per year because the smoke like makes the sound less. It's just so interesting that like this is this Western town with this mystical thing existing on the outskirts of it. Yeah. I love the details here. It's so like, again, like mixing genres.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's fun how he'll just spend just enough time to let you kind of forget that there's a magic in this world and then bring it back in such a weird way.
Yeah. Yeah. So the wind also happens to blow Roland's hat off, and we see his jet black hair. And Susan, as she sees it, suddenly feels the urge to run her hands through it. And I bring this up not because I like think that's weird. I don't. I think she's just really, really attracted to this dude and wants to touch his beautiful hair. But there's so many bits and pieces throughout this week's reading where these encounters are kind of mirroring each other, at least a little bit. Right before Rhea hypnotized Susan, she was kind of like running her hands through her long hair, right? Like over and over again, she was running her hands through Susan's hair. And now we see in this moment, she sees Roland's hair and wants to run her hands through it. And so like, I feel like we're drawing connections between these two encounters.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know where to go with that, but like the idea that there is something magical going on here. Like you know, she did see the pink light briefly. Maybe she got a little bit of a residual lust pulse.
Could be.
That.
Could be.
You know, I agree with you that it's fairly realistic for teenagers to be this horny this quickly. But also maybe there's something more going on here.
Yeah. I guess we'll see. There's also this really fascinating word usage I kind of want to zoom in on here. When discussing how long the Thinny has been there, Roland asks if it's getting bigger. And her response is like, yeah, it's growing. Thinnies grow. That's what they do. And this one will eventually overtake the entire town. But she says, not in your time or mine. And I found that expression really interesting to me because they're basically the same age, right?
Yeah.
He's 14. She's 16. Like that's not that far off of each other, but she uses the phrase in your time or mine. They have the same time, but also they don't, because Susan dies and Roland goes on. So like, I don't know, like it's just this weird phrase that really jumped out at me at this reading. Like this almost kind of prophetic, like we're not going to share the same time for very long. You are going to go on. I am not.
Yeah, it is prophetic in a way where it wouldn't be out of place in Shakespeare, actually. Like,
sure.
Like just that you can imagine that being a Shakespeare line where, you know, the hint of it resonates throughout the story where, you know, you could also just say like she's at this point, she's maybe trying to put distance between them. And so she wouldn't say our time. She'd say your time or mine. I don't know. It's cool. One thing that sticks out to me about that is saying all thinnies grow is kind of terrifying because it directly implies that like eventually the world will be swallowed up by these dimensional rifts, because if they only grow, they're just eventually gonna just keep growing, right?
Yeah. I mean, we know that like this is, theoretically before the tower, whatever's going on with the tower is happening, right? So
theoretically, yeah, we don't know.
But this thinny already exists and it's kind of slowly getting bigger.
I mean, this could be the same thinny for all we know. I don't know. I guess I don't really know the geography.
Yeah. It's not. But
okay, cool.
All right. So the flirting continues as Susan like uses this sexy flourish to dismount from Rusher, a flourish that she specifically says is meant to be done in pants, but she's wearing a dress, so she shows Roland some of that sweet Susan leg. And Roland here basically tells Susan that he wants to ask her out, but that he can tell that her situation is complicated enough that he doesn't think it's worth it. And Susan's response to that is to plant a kiss on him. And this is my favorite line in the whole week's reading, Matt. The kiss was brief, but not sisterly.
Yeah, I mean,
it's perfect.
Yeah, like we see Roland handling his horniness in one way, and she's handling it in another way, and they both leave completely flustered and wanting each other, and telling each other, or telling themselves like, oh, it's just not meant to be, but also at the same time being like, God, I want this.
Yeah. And so we end the chapter with Susan kind of waving to, or looking at Roland as he walks away, and Roland turns and waves at her and she waves back. And the last lines of the chapter are, Susan lifted her own in return and then went her way, feeling happy and unhappy at the same time. Yet, and this was perhaps the most important thing, she no longer felt soiled. When she had touched the boy's lips, Ria's touch seemed to have left her skin. A small magic, perhaps, but she welcomed it. I mean, like, once again, King is like going out of his way to compare these two encounters, right? Like the terrible encounter mixed with the positive encounter, the worst thing she's ever experienced mixed with this hope. And there's magic to both of them. Even if here it's a small magic, it's less of like maybe literal magic and more just the power of attraction, the power of the feelings they've already starting to feel for each other. But I love how these two encounters that she has this night are related to each other in that way. They connect to each other. Yeah,
there's also maybe like the good kind of lust has erased a little bit of the bad kind of lust in a sense.
Right. Yeah, that kind of pure magic, the magic of love, the magic of attraction, the magic of this natural feeling has erased these supernatural.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so let's move on to chapter 4, titled Long After Moonset, which is, moonset is a wonderful word that I don't see used enough. People should say moonset more.
Okay, I'll use it many, many times going forward.
Okay. So the final chapter of this week's reading is almost kind of like a montage as we cycle through the 3 major players that are going to be involved in the events to come. You could kind of look at this whole week's reading as the table setting of our story. Our characters have had a chance encounter, there's trouble everywhere, and now chapter 4 serves as kind of the end of the beginning. We go through 3 point of views here, and first of all, we have Roland. And we finally get to see what was going on in Roland's head during this whole exchange, and he describes it as if someone has lit a fire in him. We see that he rode his horse for 2 hours after he left Susan just to let his blood cool. So, he horny. He horny as fuck.
Yeah, poor horse. We're just like, it's nighttime.
Can we go to bed?
Yeah. Oh, man.
But his blood has finally cooled. He's able to stand up in jeans again. And as he approaches their encampment, Cuthbert Allgood has heard him approach and has set a funny little trap for him, which is, I think his like skull looking like a saddle ornament is hanging down from a tree right in front of him. And we see Roland, he dipped for his guns the 3rd time he'd done that. And for a 3rd time, there was nothing there. So that's a 3 beat there where we see the other 2 times through Susan's perspective, and she notices each of them in which he's startled and dips for his guns, not thinking about it. I think one of them was when he heard the thinny. And so he doesn't have them. He doesn't have his guns, and he felt he wanted them.
It is technically a 3 beat, but it doesn't feel like it's resolved, you know? It feels like there's going to be another beat of Roland dipping for his guns and it actually mattering, you know?
Yeah.
It definitely feels like a setup for something.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about 3 beats a lot because generally they work in 3, like, right, set up, reinforce, and then I always forget the last word in that.
Subvert.
Subvert. Thank you. That's the one. But just because it's that doesn't mean that that's how it always has to operate. You can do set up, reinforce, subvert. You can do you can do anything with it. It's just a general rule.
Right. I mean, I've always viewed the reinforce as just like remind the reader this thing exists so that it doesn't feel like it came out of nowhere. So
so that the subversion lands better. Yeah. Totally. So that absolutely could be, and well, let's pay attention to him dipping for guns in the future.
Yes.
So here we have Cuthbert, and the thing I like about this is Roland like immediately admits that he doesn't understand Cuthbert and never has. Like he's just like, I don't know who this guy is. Like I get it. He's funny. Like he's always joking and he's always silly, but there is something underneath that silliness that Roland has never quite gotten a good grasp on. And I think like the book has invited us to make comparisons between Cuthbert and Eddie. And I think that is one way in which they are both the same, right? In that Roland just has trouble getting them. He's just not the type of person that can understand these complex, multiple layered people. He just doesn't get it.
Yeah, because he's just Roland. Yeah.
Right. But I do like this one part here where he says, "Fie," Cuthbert repeated, as if he liked the sound of the world. Not archaic, only in the forgotten backwaters like Magus. That's a fine way to treat the guard of the watch, smacking the poor thin-faced fellow halfway to the nearest mountain range. Cuthbert is always silly, right? For sure. But I think one of the things this and a lot of this part shows us is how young these kids are. Like 14 years old and suddenly sent out on this mission. Cuthbert is silly, but also like, I think he's just like, this is the coolest thing ever. Like, this is the, like I get to use words that only are not archaic where we are in Magus, because I'm now out in Magus and I get to use these silly, archaic sounding words that work here. He's like playing a part and he's like loving this adventure that they're on, not realizing how much danger these kids are actually in.
Yeah, I like that for sure. He's having a grand old time, right? This is an adventure for him, and I think I don't think any of them realize how serious this is probably going to get pretty soon.
Sure. And one of the little details I like is how none of them can get like that shows how not serious they're taking this thing is they can't remember to use the right names. Like Roland chastises Cuthbert here for calling him Roland and not Will Dearborn, and then he chastises him again for calling him Gunslinger. But then moments later, Roland is like, "Is Elaine awake?" And Cuthbert's like, "That's not his name."
Yeah. So
like none of them can quite get on the same page and are quite as responsible enough to remember these things. And like we just said, this is dangerous. Like I think one of the things the end of chapter 4 shows us is that these boys are in over their head with what's going on in this place. And they cannot be making silly mistakes like this. They're lucky that it's happening now when they're alone, but they could get in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. They're not taking it seriously. These are not the gentleman bastards, to reference the other book series that we just talked about extensively on our book club on the Doofcast, which you should subscribe to. So the first thing I noticed about Cuthbert, having finally, met the more grown up version of Cuthbert here, is that he's not Eddie. And maybe that sounds stupid, but I was honestly expecting this older Cuthbert to be basically Eddie except for Midworld. But Cuthbert is a different cat. I think Cuthbert and Eddie both like seem deeply inclined to make light of things, potentially as a way of coping with things. But I can't really imagine Eddie setting up a prank like this. Like I don't even think young Eddie would have set up a prank like this. I feel like the only part of Eddie that isn't serious is his mouth, because he'll mouth off even when he does the right thing, He'll mouth off even in the face of danger where he is being brave. But I'm kind of less confident in Cuthbert. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit unfair based on just this little prank he pulled. But again, like setting a prank for an ally when you're on a dangerous mission into enemy territory is just like, it's stupid in a way that I don't even think Kid Eddie was this stupid, you know?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is really fascinating, and we can't come to a conclusion about this definitively yet, but I really like taking your idea and kind of combining it with what I was just talking about, where what if they're not actually alike at all? And the only reason Roland thinks they are is because he can't understand either of them and just compares them on the most surface level thing, which is like, oh, they're silly guys. These just silly. Yeah, look at these silly guys. They're exactly alike. I think that's really interesting because it shows how little he got Cuthbert and how little he gets Eddie.
Yeah, we're going to have to see more of Cuthbert behaving under pressure, because the thing that stands out about Eddie, and that one of the major things I think that makes you love him, is that he's smart and resourceful and he makes the right decisions at important times. It really is just that he can't control his mouth specifically.
Yeah.
And we'll just have to see if Cuthbert, how he does.
Yeah, totally. All right. So as Roland sits down to finally sleep, he thinks back to his father's charge to him. We kind of learned that John Farson is a much greater threat than anyone has really realized, and that the final battles against the good man are coming and coming soon. And I once again, Matt, I want to circle back to this idea that King reminds us that what the good man wants, or what he's claiming to want, is democracy. Roland's father had said, and it was so often the case with popular revolutions, that game was apt to be over before many of the baronies of Midworld had begun to realize that John Farson was a serious threat. Or, if you were one of those who believed passionately in his vision of democracy and an end to what he called class slavery and ancient fairy tales, a serious agent of change. So does Stephen King hate democracy, Matt?
Totally. By that I mean no, that's stupid. I think King throughout the story is rightly pointing out, or rather through the story, via the story, is pointing out that manipulative leaders will say whatever it is that they think people want to hear to get power.
Sure.
Ending class slavery sounds very appealing if you're a peasant, but we know enough to doubt that Farson intends anything other than more class slavery with himself on top. And I can also see the appeal of ending ancient fairy tales if your world is a weird fairy tale world.
Sure. Except, as we will learn by the end of this week's reading, that the pink glass orb that Rhea of the Coos now has came from Farson. So the idea that he's going to be ending ancient fairy tales, he seems to be embracing ancient fairy tales.
Yeah.
It's like he's really into this stuff because he's got this magical artifact that he's now given to a witch to hide magically.
Yeah.
So I think it does poke holes in this is bullshit. And I mean, it's interesting because I think you're kind of supposed to be like, well, I mean, it kind of seems like the way things are run in Midworld aren't great, but yeah, that doesn't mean we need to be cheering on the good man.
Right. Sure. I mean, definitely. Right. But the good man definitely seems to be a creature of the Crimson King. I don't know if we know that, but I just feel like you can assume that all these forces are aligned in some way, or yeah.
So then we get to this part, and this feels important. So let's talk about it for a bit. His father had told him more, not everything, and he had understood more, far from everything, nor did his father understand everything. The Dark Tower had not been mentioned by either of them, but it already hung in Roland's mind, a possibility like a storm cloud far away on the horizon. Was the tower what all of this was really about? Not a jumped-up harrier with dreams of ruling Midworld, not the wizard who had enchanted his mother, not the glass ball which Stephen and his posse had hoped to find in Cressia, but the Dark Tower? He hadn't asked. He hadn't dared ask. So this is the first mention of the tower in Roland's story, and it is interesting to me that already here at 14 years old, the Dark Tower has not gripped him like it will in the future, but it's already there a little bit.
Yeah, he knows something about it. He knows enough for it to be this dreadful, maybe powerful and alluring thing on the horizon that he doesn't know if he has anything to do with it, but he knows something about it. We don't know what he knows about it. The text is actually very deft here in terms of kind of making you feel like you've learned something when you haven't at all.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a wonderful phrase there. His father had told him more, not everything, in parentheses. And like we don't get any of that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
It doesn't actually tell us any of that.
Tell us. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, we also learn here that they were looking for the glass orb, which they didn't get it because Farson got it and gave it to Rhea.
Which is immediately like, you sent Roland here to keep him out of danger, but you have just sent him into the hornet's nest, unrealizing it. And you once again have to say, well, is this just oops? Or is this the wheel of Ka turning towards Roland's destiny? You know?
Yeah.
I guess we'll see.
We'll see.
So Roland's mind then shifts to Susan, and we get this wonderful, wonderful moment here. Be careful, Roland. Don't let your feeling for the girl tip anything over. She's not free anyway. She said as much. Not married, but spoken for in some other way. Roland was far from the relentless creature he would eventually become, but the seeds of that relentlessness were there, small stony things that would, in their time, grow into trees with deep roots and bitter fruit. Now one of these seeds cracked open and sent up its first sharp blade. What's been spoken for may be unspoken, and what's done may be undone. Nothing's sure, but I want her.
Damn, I love that writing.
Oh, it's so good. It's all so good.
Yeah. I mean, this is great metaphor, right? If you're teaching English class, this extended metaphor about the seeds and the roots and the sharp blade of the first, that's so beautiful.
I think it's also pretty significant that he had this thought process where he's thinking about something around the tower, and then he shifts from that to these thoughts of Susan. And it's almost this idea that he's not obsessive enough with the tower yet to where he's able to think about something else. He's able to be thinking about the Dark Tower or thinking around the Dark Tower, and then he shifts to something else. He shifts to Susan, and that occupies him almost totally, to the point where the relentlessness, which with Roland is described, is not described for his musings around the tower. It's described for his musings around Susan. And that's really interesting, because I think this is technically the only part in these first 4 chapters where the frame of the story breaks and we acknowledge that we, the reader, are aware of Roland's future. I think it's the only time that's happened so far. And
I think you might be right.
I think it's really interesting that it comes here not about the Dark Tower, but about Susan Delgado.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think, I feel like the Dark Tower is a minor part of this backstory. This is more about Roland. Obviously if we get the orb and everything, but this is more about Roland and Susan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. So we then switch over to Susan's point of view. She recounts her aunt's reaction to her returning, noticing, like Cuthbert did with Roland, that she's changed in some way. She has like this blush of love.
Mm-hmm.
We then learn that Aunt Cord is receiving quite a bit of money for this arrangement with the mayor, and is annoyed to learn that the money is going to be delayed by Rhea's demand for her to wait till the demon moon. And I think this is in line with exactly what you're talking about, Matt, where I think King is definitely trying to set up the fact that her aunt is manipulating her in some way. And her aunt is probably, I think Susan directly thinks that her aunt might be squirreling away some of the money she's earning. Like, how much of this money is Susan going to get to see?
Right.
Probably not much of it.
Right. Yeah. I think this is gonna be a terrible Stephen King character type person who's just using her.
But we also have people on either side of our characters that are kind of have a vested interest in keeping them apart, right? I mean, we've got Rhea as defined as one of those people. We've got Roland has Cuthbert, who, just like Cord, notices a change in him. And he hides this from Cuthbert, or he doesn't technically hide it. He just says, we'll talk about it tomorrow, which who knows what he's going to actually talk about tomorrow.
Right.
But we have these people with an interest in keeping them apart. And that's kind of setting up this moon-crossed lovers here.
Yeah.
I think it's really ominous.
Yeah. He's a Montague. It's really interesting to read because part of you really wants these kids to get together, while another part of you knows full well that it's doomed and will definitely lead to Susan's death. So it puts you in a weird spot. Actually, I guess it is a bit like Romeo and Juliet, where Romeo and Juliet basically opens with them being like, yeah, they're gonna die. Yeah. Anyway, here's the story. It's kind of what we have here, basically.
It's exactly what we have here. I mean, it's not said as directly as it is at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, but we basically know the same thing, right? Like a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Susan goes to bed, and as she does, she begins to pleasure herself, thinking not of Rhea and that awful thing that was done to her, but of Roland. And once again, Matt, we look at sex as not an inherently bad thing in the world of Stephen King. Sex and lust and attraction are not evil, but it seems that when it is artificially produced, it is depicted with malice. Demons and wizards and balls of glass to manipulate you, versus natural instincts, natural, normal instincts of young people. It's really, really interesting, and I want to pay attention to this in what is essentially a love story we're seeing here. And I think it's going to be important to see how these things play out within this love story.
Yeah, I agree. I think. Yeah, I guess that's true. We said this is a Western / fantasy, but actually it's also a tragic love story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, so we move to the last little vignette, and we head into Hambry for the first time, and inside the Traveler's Rest, the local hotel / saloon. I really love King's slow and deliberate introduction of this bar and the people that reside within it. Like he'd kind of like, it's almost like you can kind of see this camera like pan over the bar as we see the detail of like it's empty. It's really early in the morning, so like nobody's there, and it's just like this is the rough and tumble part of the town. And of course we meet Sheb, the pianist, who we of course recognize from The Gunslinger. Matt, you remember poor Sheb?
I do. Yeah, we finally run into Sheb. I kind of want to go back and reread the part where we run into Sheb. Maybe not yet. Maybe wait till we finish this part of the story with Sheb, and then we'll maybe get a better understanding for what that interaction meant.
Yes, I think you should wait. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll learn by the end of the section that Jonas, who is one of the first people we've seen in the world to carry a gun, is a failed gunslinger. He tried the line and failed and was sent out to the West. And so this is like the first of these people we've ever met, Matt. We've never seen someone that failed this. And I like how King kind of describes him in a way that compares him to gunslingers constantly. Like, look at this description here. The card player was an oldish fellow, not as thin as the mayor or his sister, but thin. His long white hair straggled down his back. He was deeply tanned, except for his neck, where he was always burned. The flesh there hung in scant wattles. He wore a mustache so long and ragged, he wore a mustache so long the ragged white ends hung nearly to his jaw. A sham gunslinger's mustache, many thought it, but no one used the word sham to Eldred Jonas's face. He wore a white silk shirt, and a black-handled revolver hung low on his hip. His large, red-rimmed eyes looked sad on first glance. On second, a closer look showed them to be only watery. Of emotion, they were as dead as the eyes of the romp. And the romp is the animal.
Taxidermied animal, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's so good.
I know. How does King do this? Again, right? Again, second time this week. Or maybe more than the second time. I mean, so like I guess I assume that long ago King found like an old dusty antique desk with like one of its drawers stuck closed, but then he found that if you put like a little piece of raw red meat in one of the other drawers and then you close it, then like a yellowed note card slides out of the slit at the top of the stuck drawer, and then on that note card is written another character description, and then King just has a bunch of these stored somewhere.
Sure.
That's what I assume anyway.
And then, like, the more you pull the card, like, the more of your life force is sucked into the desk. I mean, this sounds like a Stephen King story that you just created.
I just don't see how else he could be this good. So. Anyway, I got like twice as worried as I already was when we learned that Jonas is a failed gunslinger, because all that really means is he got a little bit ahead of himself on testing the line, right? On challenging court. Like he's certainly still very deadly with a gun. He's old and has had a lifetime of experience. He has all that training and thinking around corners and paying attention to detail, and he's been using it. And he's, he's been good enough to live, to be white haired.
Yeah,
I don't know why it didn't occur to me, but like bad guy gunslingers is exactly who you would choose to be like the villains, right?
Yeah, especially aged bad guy gunslingers. We have young, inexperienced gunslingers versus aged, world-weary gunslingers.
Yes.
It's great. It's great. And I mean, I think the cool thing that I like about it is King is inviting us to compare these trios, right? There's 3 of them, of course, but also Jonas is joined by his fellow big coffin boy, Clay Reynolds, here in a bit. And we see that the third of the big coffin boys, Roy DePape, is still asleep. And back with Roland and Cuthbert, their third member of their trio was also still asleep. So like we're making parallels. We're drawing lines between these 2 groups, and that makes this group seem more serious because it's being compared to a trio of heroes. Does that mean what happens to one happens to the other? I mean, probably not quite as literally as that, but I do think King is inviting us to make these comparisons and be like, these are bad hombres.
Yeah, I think there will be some mirroring between individuals. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if one of them, the leader. Yeah, I guess Jonas is the leader, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
It seems like we're being invited to compare Jonas to Roland just by virtue of the fact that they were the ones who got the POVs. And I guess I don't have a lot of smart stuff to say other than he seems, competent and cold and formidable kind of in the way that you think of present day Roland.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. I wonder if there's opportunities to make comparisons between Elder Jonas and, elderly Roland.
Yeah.
We'll have to think about that as we spend some more time with him.
Yeah. Cool.
So the 2 of them talk about the 3 young babies from the affiliation that we're seeing coming into town, but they basically dismiss them as not threats, right? Because they're so young. And they don't even have guns. That's one clever things the boys did is they do have guns. They're just hidden away, which is smart because guns are such a rare resource in this world that showing off that you have a gun says something. And I think the advantage that Roland and his boys have is that these people look at them and see no threat. So they have like the unknown, the secret advantage here.
Yeah.
So that makes you feel a little bit better, right? Just a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
So the conversation then switches over to the oil fields and the tankers that they're filling for some nefarious reason. Any guess on what's going on there, Matt?
I don't know. I mean, I think I thought about it too much. At first, I thought they were just going to steal it so they could use it, and then I thought like, well, no, that they only have refineries in like Gilead, so maybe they're just going to use it to burn something or poison something. I don't know. Use it as a weapon in some way, probably.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that like they're here. Like a lot of this chapter, I think Roland comments when Susan tells Roland about the big coffin boys and like that just hey, watch out for these 3 guys. And he's kind of like why would a mayor have personal guards? That doesn't make any sense in a small sleepy hamlet like this. So there's been a lot of mystery already established about who these guys are, why they're here. We knew part of the reason they're here is because they were delivering the glass orb to Rhea, but they're doing something else here, right? There's something that's keeping them here, and it's something to do with the Sitgo fields that Roland himself seemed very interested in. So I think like you can kind of see how the book is drawing these lines of conflict, right?
Yeah.
Like we know that Roland's father is looking for this orb thing. We know that Roland was very, very curious about these oil fields, and those exact oil fields are the one where Jonas is hiding stuff. So like we can see the dotted lines of the conflicts to come at the end of this chapter. And that just makes you really excited to see how all this is going to play out.
Yeah, absolutely. He's not wasting any time setting up this conflict.
Mm-hmm. And so we leave the 2 of them making their plans to deal with this new quartet. I think they're going to make the mayor put them at a specific place, which happens to be right next to the Thinny, which thanks.
Right.
But the sun finally rises over the town. It's daytime now, and it's time to begin the story proper. We've set the table, and it's time to eat.
All right.
But that's it for us. That's it for us. We're done. Next week we'll eat. All right, Matt, let's move right into our audience discussion question, because this episode's already going very long and we still have quite a few question answers to read. So our discussion question this week was, in honor of last week's reference to The Stand, what is your favorite post-apocalyptic novel and why? So you want to read the first one?
Sure. Divide by Hero says, written by George R. Stewart all the way back in 1949.
I think I failed to pull
the name
of the thing. So let me just do a quick Google search for you.
Okay. The story that I'm about
Earth Abides. Earth Abides.
The Earth Abides. Earth Abides showing remarkably few signs of aging badly despite being old. It features a few very politically incorrect terms and ideas when viewed through modern eyes, but they do not taint the story in any way. The story as a whole is probably more relevant than ever. Humankind is pretty much wiped out by a disease, but our protagonist survives. This is the story of how he helps build a community of survivors, their hardships, their attempts at keeping civilization alive, teaching children to read, etc., while also moving from scavenging to a self-sustaining lifestyle. It features very little conflict or drama, and what little there is passes quickly. But it doesn't matter. This is the story of our humanity, of useless things we attach significance and meaning to, of how we relate to others, and of course, our dependence on what the modern world provides. The novel spans the entire lifetime of the protagonist. It is beautifully told and one of the saddest books I've ever read. Wow, it's powerful.
If you listen right now, this is my pen clicking so I can write down Earth Abides, because I want to read this right now.
It's a strong recommendation there.
Yeah, actually, what this whole question was to give me a new list of books to read. So you fell for it. Next up, we have Rob the Gob, who says, my favorite post-apocalyptic novel would have to be The Stand. Good choice. It's one of those novels that dips into so many different genres, but stays cohesive and compelling. The characters are all so interesting, and it has one of my favorite villains of any novel I've ever read. It's a classic for a reason, and I recommend it to anyone that hasn't a chance to. I recommend anyone that hasn't had a chance to read it to do so. So that's The Stand. Matt, maybe you should read that book.
Yeah, at some point, got a lot on my plate, Scott. The Amazing Duck 42 says, my favorite post-apocalyptic story is The Giver by Lois Lowry. It's not your typical massive destruction world-ending take, but it's eerie from the jump and only gets more horrific as the layers of reality are peeled back. It's mind-bendingly weird for a kid's book and tackles some incredibly heavy stuff. Eugenics, casual murder, world wars, nuclear holocaust. That's presented subtly enough that it's still okay for a kid to tackle. In fact, my 10-year-old and I are going to read it as a summer project.
That's awesome.
Yeah, man. I mean, they made us read that in like elementary school, I think. There's like a scene where they like murder a baby in that book. And you're like, okay. That's fucked up. All right, anyway.
Yeah. Rebecca B. also answers The Giver. They say it's about a society that shuns individuality in exchange for peace. One person is gifted with the knowledge of everything, including history, art, and even basic knowledge like colors. And even that knowledge is needed. And in the event that knowledge is needed and the position of knowledge protector is passed down to a single person each generation, aka the giver. Everyone else lives in blissful ignorance of everything. It's the epitome of blissfully ignorant or painfully aware. Anyway, it really made an impact on me when I was younger, to the point where I still think about it today. So lots of people like The Giver.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't put that in a bin with post-apocalyptic stories, but it totally is one. So,
yeah, it totally is. Yeah.
Deep Scorn Prisoner says the Dark Tower series, of course, from the first 3 1/8 of the series. What?
That's how far we are in the book.
Okay.
We're 3 1/8.
3 1/8 way through the series. We've seen hint after hint that something cataclysmic has happened to Roland's world and that it's only getting worse. You have Brown asking if Roland is alive or dead, since apparently it has become a spectrum now and people can't always tell at a glance. Mutants haunt tunnels, people have animal heads, and animals are born as grotesque abominations. Demons dot the landscape, twisting lives and offering prophecies. Ancient cities have fallen to ruin and are filled with roving gangs that would be right at home in a Mad Max movie. Literal monsters crawl from the sea and ask nonsense questions. Machines have gone mad and kill people for not entertaining them well enough with riddles, and time and space are in drift, bending around the quartet on their journey. There's so much vivid imagery that King uses to paint Midworld as a hollow, broken land that is home to ruined people. From the first pages, he sweeps the reader up in this epic journey of the last gunslinger, a nearly forgotten order from a collapsed civilization as he crosses a massive desert devoid of life. As the pages and miles drift past, the reader is left with the sense that the curtain is closing on Roland's world and that he and his quartet aren't even trying to save it. They seek the tower and the preservation of everything, but have seemingly written Midworld off as a lost cause. Love that. That's so well written.
That's fantastically written. Well done, Deep Square and Prisoner.
Yeah, really, kind of.
I don't think I ever would have put the Dark Tower series in that column of post-apocalyptic, but I think you can't argue with that reasoning, right? I think.
Yeah, I
totally.
mean, just everything they said here, perfectly accurate and really highlights the way in which, this is a post-apocalypse world that they're spending most of their time in.
Yeah. Pedro Nero says, I think that despite all the conflict I have about the author and all that has come from him, my favorite post-apocalyptic novel would still have to be Battlefield Earth. Probably because I discovered it when I was so young, and I've always loved the idea of a story really only getting started with what normally would have been the end of the novel in other circumstances or other books. It always felt like two novels in one, and while you could say that it would be similar to just have read two books, I'll never forget the feeling of reading it in awe as the first portion was clearly coming to an end, but I still had half the pages yet to go.
Cool.
Yeah. I never finished Battlefield Earth. I read the first half and then I was like, oh, the story's not over. And then I just never finished it. So
interesting.
I thought it was all right. I mean, L. Ron Hubbard notwithstanding. And then, of course, I read it after I saw the horrendous movie. So I was like, surely there must be something good that possessed them to make this movie. Because what could it possibly be? So I got curious and read the first half.
So it must be very different from the movie, because I don't remember anything being broken in half in the really excellent movie.
The movie ends with the first part of... Can I spoil Battlefield Earth? I don't know if it matters.
I'm fine. Skip ahead 30 seconds if you don't want to spoil Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard.
So the book ends with the humans like defeating the aliens, right?
Right.
The movie ends with that.
Yeah, right.
But the movie ends with them like sending a nuke and destroying the entire home planet of the aliens. That's not what happens in the book. In the book, they like overthrow the aliens on Earth and win. And then like the second half of the book is them dealing with the aliens, like trying to come back. And it's a much different kind of story. It's really interesting. Like I just did not expect that at all.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, L. Ron Hubbard sucks, but it was all right.
All right. S. Robinson says, I absolutely love The Stand, but for the sake of something that is not King, my favorite story is The Road. Someone recommended it to me after my first child was born, and it absolutely pushed all the right buttons and gutted me.
Yeah, and I think the next two answers are also The Road, so let's wait to talk about The Road after we get through these.
Okay.
Because we have Coves McGoves, who says, The Road. I feel like the book painted such a morbidly realistic depiction of life after society and the hard realities of that life. I won't go into details to avoid spoilers, but suffice it to say that book deeply affected me emotionally. I cannot help but to recommend it to all my friends and family. Yeah,
and then finally, The Road. I don't think any other by Garrett C. Garrett C. says that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't think any other post-apocalyptic novel has stuck with me quite so much. That fact alone likely makes it my favorite. And they say that McCarthy is arguably the best prose writer alive today. The man is just on a different level of The Tower altogether. The heavy subject matter and vivid imagery in The Road had me taking a break from McCarthy books for about a year. I mean that as a true compliment. Yeah, like the thing about McCarthy is like I've had Blood Meridian on my reading list forever, but I've never gotten around to it because I just know that it's just gonna destroy me and be fucked up. I read The Road when I was like on vacation at one point, and I distinctly remember like putting it down and just like looking out the window and just being like, God, I'm so happy that I'm alive. like what a horrible nightmare that was.
Yeah.
It's so powerful.
It is really powerful. I love that book. My wife hates it. My wife hates The Road. She was not like, I think that's the thing is I think she hates it because it worked on her.
Yes.
Because I think that's a natural reaction to reading that book is, oh my God, I hate this.
Yeah.
But that just means it's doing exactly what it wants to.
Yeah. No, it's just punches you in the face for 100, 200, whatever pages.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. All right, next up we have Sosation, who says, the first post-apocalyptic novel I read in 6th grade back in 1996 was The Postman by David Brin. Not sure if it holds up as an adult. The Kevin Costner movie that they made was atrocious, and I'm due for a reread, but the book worked wonders on my kid brain regarding what rebuilding a society could look like, and the power of stories to move masses of people to do amazing things. I have not read that book, but I did watch that horrendous movie, and it was indeed horrendous. That's got me curious about the book. I kind of want to try it out. I'm writing it down.
Cool. I have not read or watched, so I will not comment.
Cool.
S. Dryud Jailstorm. I don't think I said that right. Dryud Jailstorm says, personal favorite, the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. Hey. It shows Earth that is basically falling apart. In some version of a distant future, people are living in fear of the 5th season when all imaginable natural disasters are happening at the same time, ravaging the lands every couple of years. There are people that can influence forces of nature and quell the disasters, but are considered dangerous by the general public. And even with their usefulness, they have to hide because regular folks are hunting and killing the only people that can help. It even shares a similar premise with the Dark Tower, that the world is... the world in the past got so advanced that it collapsed in on itself. Now we find only pieces of greatness that once was. Yeah, we read the first Broken Earth book for the book club over on the Doofcast channel. We didn't read any of the subsequent books for the book club, and I haven't gotten around to them either. I finished them. Yeah, you did finish them, yeah.
Yeah, I like them a lot. N.K. Jemisin is a good author. I think the most memorable thing about that is the second person perspective that the book uses, which is something that you just don't see in stories very often, that I thought was really interesting and cool. It's a good series. I liked it.
Me too.
All right, so we have Gerardo, who says, not sure if this is out of bounds, but one of my favorite post-apocalyptic stories that comes to mind is not from a book I read, but the movie The Matrix. The first time viewing that was mind-blowing by the special effects and by the plot, which was plausible enough to be quite eerie that our own AI technology will one day come take over. In fact, when I read the Dark Tower series, my impression of Blaine was that he was an AI that had gone mad or evil, since the worlds are breaking down, time is slipping, directions are inconsistent, and of course, the AI machines are going insane too. We saw it after 3 Doors on the beach, and the robots were going berserk there too. Yeah, cool. I enjoy The Matrix at all. We also did a whole podcast on that. Look, this is just us plugging ourselves.
Yeah, I think we've just done so many shows now that it's going to happen a lot.
True.
I mean, yeah, The Matrix is one of my favorite movies. It's perfectly suited for this question.
Mm-hmm.
The Passage. Steve D says The Passage by Justin Cronin. They say this one is super well written. Whenever I explain it to people, it sounds like a story that's been told 100 times. Military creates a serum that makes super soldiers. Actually turns them into out-of-control psycho vampires. Most of humanity suffers. All that aside, the way he writes about dealing with the reality of it, not unlike The Stand, is great.
Yeah, I read that series as well. It's pretty good. I like The Stand better, but I think it's a very interesting... I think the first book was probably my favorite, and I didn't like the other two as much, but I agree with you. It's a good book. It's a good post-apocalyptic book, cool. And the vampire creatures are pretty cool. I think Stephen King recommended it, which is why I tried it out. And did not regret it. So
I've never even heard of it.
They made a television show last year, and it got canceled immediately.
Cool.
Because that's what happens. Next up, we have Peter, who says, my favorite post-apocalyptic novel that isn't The Stand, I want to go with Margaret Atwood's masterpiece, Handmaid's Tale, but I'm not sure if that counts as post-apocalyptic, but rather dystopian fiction. So I guess I'll go with Max Brooks's World War Z. It's a zombie novel told from the viewpoint of a journalist who goes around the world speaking with survivors. Max Brooks shows an almost King-esque penchant for character voices. You can really feel the different characters pop off the pages. I've never read that. Have you read that?
Nope.
I saw the bad movie.
Yeah, I saw the bad
Pitt.
movie. My understanding is that it's different and that the book actually spends a lot of more time in different people's heads, is my understanding. I don't know.
Yeah. I've everything I've heard is that the movie like bastardized the book in every way.
Turned it into just an action movie, which I'd like to read that though. Cool. Mm-hmm. Robert F. says, Swan Song is an amazing story by Robert McCammon. Good character development, interesting flow of events, and a very likable hero. They say it might have been influenced by King or vice versa.
Well, shit, writing that one down too.
All right.
We have Marie B, who says they actually list a bunch of novels that we've discussed already, including World War Z, The Road, and Swan Song, but they also picked The Stand, and I liked what Marie wrote here. My favorite parts are the small details, like how he breaks down the second wave of deaths, like the poor little boy who falls down the well, and the girl who locks herself in the freezer with her dead family. Yeah, Matt, The Stand, whew. We're going to have to read that book.
Yeah, that sounds intense.
Yeah,
right.
It's the first, I mean, I love the whole book, but the first part of the book is like describing the Captain Trips virus like spread across the United States, and it is some of the most incredible writing ever.
Yeah, interestingly, like based on my pop culture osmosis understanding of The Stand, that actually sounds like the more interesting part to me, because I mean, it seems like they get into this like struggle between good and evil thing in the latter parts of the book. And I'm like, I just kind of want to read King do a plague wipes out humanity story, you know?
Yeah. Well, you're lucky enough to have both of those.
Both of those. Great. Cool.
The Stand is long enough that it contains like 3 books in it, and they're all good.
How convenient. All right. LBT says Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. The layers of discovery about the cause of the apocalypse are compelling. Atwood creates a vivid world with an eerie tone where the reader feels as if this possible future is just next door.
I have read these as well, and I really like them. And I think we tried to put it up for vote for book club one month, and it got really, really close to winning, but didn't. I would really love to talk about Oryx and Crake with you. I think it's a fascinating story that I think you would like a lot.
Weirdly, I also feel like I haven't heard of this. So
interesting. Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Next we have Ransom, who says the entire Mad Max universe. Young Leather Mel Gibson, Dog Justice, Tina Turner and Thunderdome, Pig Shit, Furiosa's Tenacity, Water Wars, and again, Young Leather Mel Gibson.
Yeah. I mean, young Leather Mel Gibson is worth a lot. I agree.
Yeah. At least 2 points.
Yes. Finally, Zachary B says The Stand, it along with Lucifer's Hammer by Niven and Pornell are atop my list.
I have not heard of Lucifer's Hammer. Have you heard of that?
I mean, the name sounds familiar, but no also.
All right. Well, thanks for all those recommendations, everyone. That was really great. I enjoyed your answers to that a lot. I liked how many of you said The Stand. Well done. You passed my test. That was my secret test, and you're allowed to continue to listen to this podcast. Yeah,
we were going to quit if there weren't more than 4. So.
All right, next week's discussion question. This one is, what is your favorite genre that has showed up in the Dark Tower series so far, and why? So is it the Western? Is it fantasy? Is it horror? Is it one that we haven't even talked about that you think we should have talked about?
Gangster.
Yeah, just go crazy. Let us know. I think this is a really fun question. This one was a Matt question. So
yeah, they've mostly been Scott questions, but this popped into my head now that we're in Romeo and Juliet. I was like, this is a fun thing we're doing. Let's talk about this.
Awesome. All right. Well, that is it for us here on Kingslingers. Next week, we continue the story of Susan by reading chapters 5 and 6 of part 2, Susan.
Awesome. Remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod. You can also head on over to Reddit, the subreddit, r/doof media, and you can participate in the threads where, you can answer the discussion question, or you can just chat with folks about this week's reading.
That's right. Any of those places are great places to submit that discussion question. And if you are not subscribed to Kingslingers, we strongly, strongly recommend you do so you'll never miss an episode. As always, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and pretty much anywhere else that there are podcasts.
Yep. And if you like any of our shows, this one, the Doofcast, the one that we mentioned 170 times, consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia. If you donate to us at the $10 level, that allows you to, what level allows to, what's happening here?
Are you just gonna stop? You're just gonna
I'm trying to find a place to resume reading.
Just I missed words. Just create a sentence.
It's too late. It's completely derailed. Anyway,
if you donate at the $10 level, there's bonus podcasts.
Bonus podcasts. Yeah, I think Scott skipped one word and it just destroyed my mind. There's bonus podcasts. Me and my brother have actually been doing these bonus discussion podcasts where if you donate $10 a month or higher, then you get to basically have exclusive access to these conversations between me and my brother, which people actually seem to be enjoying. There was a extremely lengthy and fun discussion about string theory in the Discord today, which I was very surprised at. Anyway, check over on the Discord. You get tons of other great benefits on patreon.com/doofmedia.
Yeah, you fucking nerds over there. Your string theory shit.
Yeah, it was great. I know you're all interested in string theory. Special thanks to new patrons this week: Bedoofs Shrey, Tobias W, David L, and Alexander P, and new Doof warrior Byron K. Welcome, and we hope to see you around the Discord and around the community.
Thank you so much for the support, folks. We really do appreciate that. But if you cannot afford to donate to us, that is absolutely okay. You can, like we always say, share this podcast. It's been about a month and a half since someone has talked about us on r/books. So maybe it's time to do that again.
Yeah. We're not telling you to do that. But if you were to just link the podcast there, it would be awesome.
Anytime someone mentions Stephen Cy King at any time.
Yeah.
Or, of course, you can always just help us out by leaving us a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Matt R408, who I don't think is this. I think this is a different Matt than you, right, Matt?
This is not me.
All right. Matt R gives us 5 stars and says, "Gods be praised. I just stumbled upon this 2 episodes in. This is my new favorite King podcast. I have journeyed to the tower 4 times, and this podcast teaches me more. I can't read. Teaches me more. Oh, it's like I did, Matt. It teaches me more. I love how the hosts are a tower veteran and a newbie looking forward to listening for months to come. Thank you so much, Matt. We really do appreciate that. And thank you to everyone who has left a rating and a review. We've got a bunch of them, and we really do appreciate that, folks. It really, really, really does help. All right. Well, that is it. This very, very long episode. Gosh, sorry it's so long, everyone. But we will see you here back next week as we continue the story of Susan and Roland. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.